to see you.
I won't be on the stage, but I really truly appreciate your presence. We look forward to listening to your talk. I've read your report papers with a lot of interest.
Thank you.
Same as our
네,
fellow.
지금 말씀하고 계셔가지고 교수님께서.
Honor to be here.
Thank you. See you later.
See ya.
So hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Yuna Choi, Program Manager of NEREC KAIST. I'd like to thank all participants who are now watching this video. This is the second day of 2021 NEREC Conference on Nuclear Nonproliferation. This morning, we'll have session 3 titled with Can North Korea Have Nuclear Energy? Before moving on the session, we'll have a special session inviting 2 distinguished guests. I'd like to introduce the session chair, Dr. Junhyung Kim. He is Chancellor of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy and Professor of Handong Global University. His areas of specialization and interest are theories of international relations, Northeast Asian relations, including US-China, US-RK, and North-South Korean relations. He was also invited as a Fulbright scholar to George Mason University, USA, and taught several courses, including US-Korea relations and East Asian and international politics. Since 2011, Dr. Kim has involved in the Korea Peace Forum, a renowned network-based think tank specialized in the peace and unification. Since 2016, he has been a member of Moon Jae-in's presidential election camp, where he consulted and wrote major foreign policies. After Moon was elected, he joined the Government Transition Committee and became a member of the Presidential Commission on Policy Planning, that is, Security and Foreign Policy Subcommittee. In addition to that, he belonged to advisory committees to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Unification and the National Security Council. Dr. Kim earned his bachelor's degree at Yonsei University and master and PhD at George Washington University. So Chancellor Kim, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very kind introduction, and welcome everybody to this session, special session, especially the virtual audience. I'm very honored to be a moderator for this special sessions, especially listening to and talking with Professor Jung-in Moon. Jung-in Moon, actually no need explanation or any introduction, but let me give a short list. Jung-in Moon is chairman of Sejong Institute, a leading private think tank in South Korea. And before that, he served as a special advisor to the ROK President for Foreign Affairs and National Security from 2017 to 2021. And he's also a distinguished university professor at Yonsei University. And long list of his career, if I have to explain everything, I don't think 1 hour is not enough for that. So without further ado, we are going to invite him and to speak. Especially topic is helping North Korea nuclear crisis from the CTR perspective. But he's going to give us a short keynote speech, and then we can also discuss other things, present issues. So I'm going to turn to microphone to Moon Jung-in. Welcome. Thank you very much, Chairman Moon.
Thank you, Professor and Chancellor Kim. And thank you very much, Professor Im Man-sung, for inviting me to this wonderful workshop. I think it is it has been 30 years since I joined this NEREC workshop, and I understand it has been most successful workshop on nuclear non-proliferation. And I understand all those participants in the workshop from different parts of the Asia Pacific, have been very, very successful in spreading messages on nuclear non-proliferation. And I was asked to give a talk on the CTR perspective on North Korean nuclear problem. And as you know that I'm specialist in the CTL or actual technical aspect of North Korea's denuclearization. But I'll give you basic outlines, including recent development on the Korean Peninsula. I'll give my rather in a short. I'll give about 20 to 25 minutes on the CTL perspective on North Korea, and I would rather prefer to have a Q&A session much longer. In a CTL perspective, you don't know, CTL refers to a cooperative threat reduction, and it is part of CBM measures, confidence building measures. It's very simple. It goes back to Osgood, Professor Osgood's basic idea of confidence building measures. In other words, without reducing threat from both sides, it will be very difficult to reduce tension and build a confidence among conflicting parties. And particularly if you can reduce the mutual threat, then that is the best way of averting any kind of accidental, nuclear or conventional, military escalation. Therefore, it has been widely, applied in the process of, confidence building measures and arms control and etc. But it became popularized as a result of non-Lugar initiative in 1986. In fact, the U.S. Congress passed a bill called the Soviet Threat Reduction Act of 1991. And this, according to this act, the U.S. government would allocate, $400 million per year for 4 years. Therefore, we're talking about almost, $1.6 billion to implement this, CTL initiative by Senator Nunn and Lugar. Its goal is very simple. There is to, as you know, in 1989, there was German unification, and 1999, there was a collapse of the Soviet Union and kind of disintegration of Soviet Union. Then major issue came out and how to deal with all these nuclear weapons deployed in Russia and different parts of the former Soviet Union. That includes Russia, and at the same time Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Belarus, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. And actual program of CTL involves, how to get rid of a nuclear warhead and ICBMs, ICBM silos, and ICBM mobile launchers, bombers, okay, nuclear air to surface missiles, submarine missile launchers, and etc. Therefore, we're talking about the nuclear warhead and the related infrastructure. And one of how to destroy and deactivate those kinds of nuclear weapons and related infrastructure was a principal aspect of this CTL. And particularly interesting aspect of this CTL program is to take out highly enriched uranium from nuclear warheads and turn them into commercial fuel, and the US government would buy those commercial fuel from Russia. In that way, the US could get rid of, not only just nuclear warheads, but also, highly enriched uranium. Related to that, the issue of a conversion of these nuclear weapons in the commercial sectors or for peaceful purposes. Okay. Another important issue is how to deal with the nuclear scientists and engineers and how to find jobs for them. And furthermore, if there is a stoppage of suspension of these nuclear activities, how to come up with alternative energy sources to the, Russia and the former members of the Soviet Union. Therefore, CTL has become extremely comprehensive program to deal with not only just the process of so-called destroying and deactivating nuclear warheads and related infrastructure, but also forming kinds of energy cooperation networks between Russia and the former members of the Soviet Union and the United States. Therefore, since then on, the CTR has become extremely popular, and also it has been very, very successful in that way. It has the CTR has a significantly reduced nuclear threat coming from Russia, and at the same time, it was successful in getting rid of nuclear weapons in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Okay, and also I understand Siegfried Hecker, Dr. Hecker, is writing a book on his experience of his participation in CTR program for almost 10 years, and I think he should have published a book. It's about 1,000 pages on his personal experience of, declaration, verification, and actual dismantling of nuclear warhead as a technical expert. Therefore, this kind of successful case, even though the whole CTL the initiative has become very much diluted from during the days of Bush administration and Obama administration, but Clinton administration and the senior Bush administration and Clinton administration, it was a quite successful program. That is why when we had the so-called North Korea nuclear issue, obviously this idea popped out. Why don't we adopt the CTL program to North Korea? Because CTL is the most important way of reducing tension and building confidence, as well as fundamentally dismantling and deactivating North Korean nuclear program. But in South Korea, very few paid attention to CTL issue. But under the Moon Jae-in government, former Minister of Unification Kim Yeon-chul has been very, very active in promoting the idea of CTL. And obviously, the Office of the President, the Blue House, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were rather hesitant to go along with the Ministry of Unification initiative. There are several reasons. First reason is it is too premature because there hasn't not been any substantial progress in nuclear negotiation. And if we made the CTL proposal ahead of the denuclearization negotiation, that can undermine the American negotiation position. Therefore, the United States was very, very skeptical of this CTL proposal. And our Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Blue House wanted to go in tandem with the United States. Therefore, they are rather skeptical of the Ministry of Unification proposal. But from the Ministry of Unification perspective, CTL is the best way of accelerating the process of denuclearization negotiation, because CTL will be the most concrete incentive that can be shown to North Korea. Therefore, Ministry of Unification has been really pushing for that idea. The current Unification Minister, Lee In-young, has also been championing this idea of CTL. Then now, what kinds of CTLs we have in mind, particularly with regard to the energy, the perspective? They have several ideas. Obviously, most important idea is, obviously, North Korea will be wanting, nuclear energy. Then North Korea, even if North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons program and facilities, and including nuclear warhead bombs, North Korea will be wanting the peaceful use of energy. Peaceful use of nuclear energy has two dimensions. One is obviously North Korea will be wanting light water nuclear reactor, of which construction was suspended since the rise of the second nuclear crisis in 2002 and 3. Okay, at a time, Korea Energy Development Organization was building 2 light water nuclear reactors in Sinpo, North Korea. But after John Bolton initiated the second nuclear crisis in 2002, the entire KIDO program, the construction of 2 light water nuclear reactors in Sinpo, just disappeared. Okay, but North Korea still be wanting the light water nuclear reactor. Therefore, we can think about it, okay, for electric purposes and kinds of things. Another thing is in North Korea, if they give up these nuclear facilities in Yongbyon, North Korea will be wanting some kind of a replacement of 5 megawatt nuclear reactor there. It's for much more for research purposes. In the case, maybe Hanaro nuclear reactor, the so-called experimental nuclear reactor, would be good because the Hanaro nuclear reactor has an international reputation, and particularly Dr. Siegfried Hecker has been suggesting that the provision of Hanaro nuclear reactor for research purposes will be a wonderful incentive to North Korea. Okay, therefore, there is kinds of things that we are talking about. It is still long way to go, but anyhow, North Korea will be wanting to, as I pointed out, the light water nuclear reactor and some sort of research reactor such as Hanaro. Therefore, there is one item we can think about it, okay? And obviously, in doing that, one important one is, as in the case of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and in its members, if in the process actual denuclearization of North Korea, and now it is estimated that the North Korea might have a 30 to 40 nuclear warheads, but according to American intelligence agencies, North Korea is estimated to have about 60 to 70 nuclear warheads. Then we have a process of turning those the nuclear, fissile materials in nuclear warhead into the commercial version of highly enriched uranium or the PU, whatever, plutonium, whatever. That process we should be involved in too. Another aspect is we can think about giving some kinds of incentive regarding the thermal power. Now, North Korea's mainstay of electric generation is hydro power, mostly from Supung Dam and other kinds of remote part of North Korea. But the mainstay of North Korean energy is a thermal power plant. For example, in Pyongyang has 2 thermal power plants. One is a Pyongyang thermal power plant, another is East Pyongyang, Dongpyeongyang thermal power plant. But they have become source of major pollution. Okay, therefore, from the point of view of climate change, carbon neutrality, those thermal power plants in Pyongyang have become very, very problematic. Therefore, another way is this: as a part of this CTL package, we can propose to North Korea that we can, really modernize and update, those, thermal power plant in Pyongyang to meet the overall standards of carbon neutrality. And my guess is this: is North Korea is most likely to buy this proposal, okay? Because Chairman Kim Jong-un has been really championing carbon neutrality and fighting against climate change. Therefore, I think that proposal, if that can be the part of CTL, will be extremely attractive to Pyongyang. And third, in the category of energy network or cooperation within the frame of CTL is alternative energy. You may recall that when there was a second summit, second North-South Korean summit in October 2007, and the North and the South have agreed to cooperate in building tidal power plant in Haeju, okay? But as inter-Korean relations get soured, there has been no progress in Haeju tidal power plant. But the North Korean officials have showed a very strong interest in building this tidal power plant in Haeju. Therefore, that could be one area of mutual cooperation, okay? And another area is solar power and wind power, okay? And you may recall that Peter Hayes of the Nautilus Institute was a pioneer of building this wind power plant in outskirts of Pyongyang in late 1990s, okay? And it was very successful. And also when I visited Pyongyang in 2018, during the third Pyongyang summit, several North Korean officials, showed a great expression, showed a great interest in these alternative energy sources, okay? He was talking about, he didn't mention the tidal power plant, but he mentioned about the solar energy and, wind power, energy. Therefore, that could be another important areas for, cooperation. Another one is, it's a much broader framework of energy cooperation. That is what President Moon Jae-in has been proposing, that there should be, very close energy cooperation network, particularly such as gas pipeline network and, the oil pipeline network, because our government has a big plan of connecting oil and gas in Siberia, including, including Sakhalin 2 project, linking through the Nakhta and coming down through North Korea and all the way to South Korea. In the process, we can share those gas or oil with North Korea, okay? As part of the fee for passage of oil and gas through the North Korean territory, okay? Therefore, that is one of interesting idea, and North Korea also showed an interest too. But most importantly, from our point of view is how to really convert North Korean nuclear scientists and engineers. There are different figures. Some said that there are North Korea has about 10,000 nuclear related and scientists and engineers, and some argue that North Korea has about up to 3,000 nuclear scientists and engineers. How to retrain them, how to convert them into the non-nuclear sector would be another interesting case. And plus, all issue of how South Korea can involve in the process of declaration, verification of North Korean nuclear problems. Of course, South Korea is not, so-called, qualified to join that effort. That will be very much determined by the, United States and all big powers on the so-called nuclear weapons related one, and as a so-called civilian nuclear and energy sector, IAEA will be taking initiative. But still, our, nuclear energy related institutions like such as CARE or the KINOC, they are very much interested in participating in actual verification and in dismantling process. That is their concerns too. But problem is this, therefore those are the kinds of things, the ideas which have been floating around in South Korea. But putting for CTL initiative is not that easy. The most important thing is North Korea should make a full commitment to denuclearization, because without North Korean cooperation, we cannot make any even single inch of progress in the area of the CTL. Therefore, North Korean commitment to denuclearization will be the most important necessary condition. Second, most important issue is, to what extent, major stakeholders to the North Korean nuclear issue, particularly United States, to what extent, United States is committed to the CTL. The most important thing here is financial commitment. It requires huge investment. And I really don't think the US Congress would come up with that kind of money, as in the case of 1991 Soviet, threat reduction initiative. Okay, then the money should come from somewhere else. Okay, as we did for the KIDO. For example, in the case of KIDO project, the building 2 light water nuclear reactor in Shimpo, the actual money for construction came mostly from South Korea. South Korea, invested almost $4 billion. Japan, about $800 million, something like that, and a little bit of money coming from Australia and EU. But likewise, Keto formula can be a good format. Even Keto formula need American blessing. Then whole issue to what extent America will be committed to the idea of the CTR. Okay, but the way I understand, because I'm now vice chairman of APLN, Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and APLN has been working with NTI, Nuclear Threat Initiative, which was co-founded by Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar. And I've been talking with them to organizing some kind of workshop or conference on CTR. But NTI seems to be somewhat, reluctant to go along with it. Therefore, the overall atmosphere in Washington indicate that, U.S. is not really interested in going along with the CTR unless North Korea shows very firm commitment. But in coming up with the financing, what we need is political support, okay, from U.S. Congress, the South Korean National Assembly, Japanese Diet, okay, even European, EU Parliament, those things will be very important. Unless we have that kind of political blessing, then we cannot really go for, this idea of CTR. Another important thing, perhaps the most important thing, is this: the major stakeholders, the US, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, China, Russia, EU, and whatever, they should come up with some kind of meaningful roadmap, because the CTR would not have any meaning without having very clearly defined roadmap, because CTR is all involved in give and take. Okay, if North Korea makes a certain degree of denuclearization, then the outside actors or stakeholders would come up with this kind of CTR-related incentive to North Korea. Therefore, CTR should be an integral part of overall denuclearization package of North Korea. Okay, then now whole issue is, unless you activate the nuclear negotiation, not only between the Pyongyang and Washington, but also among major stakeholders, be it six-party format or whatever. Without that process, we cannot talk about roadmap. Therefore, it is a quite complicated process. Okay. Then now, in view of this, I would say that CTR is a very interesting idea, and it is quite worthy of pursuing the project. But whole issue is, in terms of desirability, it is a wonderful initiative, but in terms of feasibility, it seems to be very, very low, because it is tied up to a North Korean nuclear negotiation. But North Korean nuclear negotiation is now complete in a dead end, particularly since the Hanoi SEPEC in February 2019. You all know, what happened in Hanoi, because at the time, North Korea came up with a very interesting proposal. North Korean proposal was that, okay, we will make a complete and permanent dismantling of all the nuclear facilities in Yongbyon, okay, in return for American support of, partial relaxation of sanction resolutions on North Korea, particularly those 5 sanction resolutions which were adopted since 2016. But President Trump at the time just turned them down, saying that North Korea came up with the so-called some deal approach. Okay, we'll give up Yongbyon. Okay, then you should lift sanctions partially. But the American approach was this: no, we cannot accept it. You get rid of all the nuclear weapons, all ranges of ballistic missiles, biochemical weapons. Okay, then we'll promise bright future of your economy. Obviously, Kim Jong-un cannot could not take that kind of offer from President Trump. Then Trump made a big deal, returned to Washington with no deal. Okay, and then at that time the Trump administration claimed that that was a triumph for the United States. And all the hardliners in Washington supported the decision, but South Korean government was very angry about that decision because North Korean proposal on some deal was very, very meaningful. When you talk about Yongbyon nuclear facilities, not a small deal. That is in fact a big deal. It has a 5 megawatt nuclear reactor. It has a fuel fabrication plant. It has, radiochemical reprocessing plant to produce plutonium. It has a tritium laboratory. Tritium is essential for the production of hydrogen bomb. It has highly enriched uranium nuclear facilities, highly enriched uranium production facilities. More importantly, Yongbyon has Nuclear Weapons Research Institute. North Korea is willing to give them up. I still do not understand why the President Trump didn't take them up. Okay. Some people said, the conservatives in South Korea said, they account for less than 10% of North Korean nuclear weapons capability. No, but other other experts such as Siegfried Hacker, even conservative David Albright argued that the Yongbyon nuclear facilities account for 50%, at least 50% of North Korean nuclear weapons capability. Hacker said 60 to 70%. That is a big deal. And another important thing is this: there has not been since 1994 Geneva Agreed Framework settlement. There was no meaningful progress, successful cases between Washington and Pyongyang. But if North Korea, the United States have taken the North Korean proposal and made a successful precedent, then things could have been completely different. Now, I would say that we are facing a kind of complete deadlock. Now, whole issue is this: Americans saying that now we have a new government, you got to come out to the working level talks. Then we can talk about the incentives and others. The North Koreans saying that no, we don't want to be fooled by you. You come up with much clear incentives. Then we may consider sending delegates to the working level talks. Therefore, it is a kind of catch-22 situation between Washington and Pyongyang. There's no progress. And also at the same time, South Korea and North Korea, produced the Panmunjom Declaration, Pyongyang Declaration, and our government made several promises in North Korea on inter-Korean exchange and cooperation, and etc. But because of American-led sanction regime, we couldn't implement any of those promises. Therefore, North Korea began to suspect our intention, our will, our autonomy. Therefore, North Korea is not willing to talk with us. Kim Yo-jong, sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, even has been saying that now inter-Korean relations has become hostile. Therefore, U.S.-North Korea relations is kind of stalled because of regarding the whole issue of who take initiative. And it's a very deeply rooted mutual distrust between Pyongyang and Washington. Inter-Korean relations has become completely suspended. And there was good news last week. North Korea announced that it will restore all the suspended channels of communication. It's willing to go ahead. But then again, North Korea put another precondition. That is what? Unless you suspend the allocate U.S. joint military exercise, which is planned in August, we may not, inter-Korean relations, will be facing major challenges and troubles. It has become kind of a precondition. Therefore, current situation is quite, it's kind of gloomy. Therefore, I cannot give it. I'm naturally very optimistic person, but I cannot give very optimistic prospect for the current situation. By way of concluding my talk, I would say that the CTL is a very, very promising area. Okay, we should prepare for it. But the CTL is very much technical dimension of entire North Korean nuclear negotiation. Therefore, unless we can come up with a macro political framework within which CTL can work out, then there is no future to CTL. But however, particularly nuclear energy related experts should prepare, okay, prepare for the the adoption and implementation of CTL framework. Therefore, we should prepare for it, but right now is not the timing. But it should be integral part of negotiation with North Korean nuclear issues. I'll stop here. No voice coming out.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Chairman Moon. Like always, your presentation, keynote speech is always insightful and we learned a lot. Very concise and to the point. Let me ask a couple of questions regarding the CTR and based on your keynote, and then I'm going to ask your current situations. CTR, as you said, is more like a liberalist kind of concept, like a security cooperation, not like based on, realism, zero-sum game. So two things I think is first, essential to be successful. One is trust. The second one is mutual interest should be somehow predictable. But as you know, this trust issue is always the problem, and one of the mistrust issue is, on the U.S. side, because U.S. demonize not all the people, but most of the people demonize North Korea. So we are a good country, you're a bad country. You give up first and trust us, and then we will compensate. But North Korean issue is we cannot give up. This is last resort. Until we can trust you, we cannot give up. Always. Everybody knows in this case it's a mutual, a simultaneous actions. But the problem is always because this is life and death issue for North Korea, but this is not the, existential issue for U.S. So in a way, like a trust and the proof, that kind of I think should come from U.S. And what do you think about that?
I think that's the most serious problem. That there is first of all, on the North Korean nuclear issue, there is an asymmetry of attention between Pyongyang and Washington. For Pyongyang, it is existential matter. For Washington, it's a matter of policy choice. Okay, therefore, that kind of asymmetry between Pyongyang and Washington has become a fundamental problem. And as you pointed out, the whole issue of demonization of North Korea. Once the United States demonizes North Korea, there's no chance for negotiation because, by definition, demons do not negotiate. Okay, therefore the assumption is faulty. That if the United States really wanted to have a negotiated settlement of North Korean nuclear problem, their attitude had changed. Then once the United States avoid demonizing North Korea, then trust building will be rather simple and easy. Okay, therefore, the whole issue of trust has been kind of captive of this demonization mentality. Okay, therefore, again, getting rid of American attitude toward the demonization of North Korea is not easy. For example, look at the CIA. CIA still has a Cold War mentality. CIA analysts look at North Korea from the prism of Cold War mindset. Therefore, it is very difficult to change it. Then here comes the importance of so-called third parties, South Korea, China, Russia, even Japan. But Japan is much closer to, American way of understanding North Korea. Okay, but the third parties should involve in it and try to come up with some kind of restructuring of a perceptual restructuring of Americans on North Korea.
Recording stopped.
Thank you very much. And my next question is, you said that it's a long way to go, and
Recording in
in
progress.
this deadlock kind of situation, it's I'm feeling like emptiness in talking about this CTR, even though it's the wonderful idea. But we try several ways. You talked about, keto, of course, and tidal power. And I even remember that, in the 2006-07, presidential campaign, and at the time, candidate Jung Dong-young, offered 2 million kilowatts, snow and the product, giving them, even though we are suffering the, electric shortage in this peak season. And of course, the nuclear, let them, give them a low risk kind of nuclear power allow, so more like a JCPOA type. So among these options, even though it's far away to go, but what do you think is the best, or do we have to combine all these?
But in the case of North Korea, in an energy situation, it will be very difficult to come up with so-called massive energy supply to North Korea, because simply because of power grid problem. They've a centralized energy supply network in North Korea will be very difficult to follow up. That is why we need some decentralized in energy network, because given North Korea's power grid situation, here comes this is why so-called Schumacher's small is beautiful kind of approach. Therefore tidal power plant for the Haeju and Hwanghae province area, okay, and solar energy panels for the remote part of North Korea. We need to approach that kind of things. Therefore, we need to have a more integrated and comprehensive approach to North Korean energy situation. But building light water nuclear reactors and supplying from central power stations to different parts of North Korea, it will take a much longer time because of power grid situation. But we can have, within the framework of CTR, we can have some kind of decentralized approach to North Korea.
Yeah, because this NEREC audience, I think, is very, very much interested in nuclear issues. So we had the bad lessons at Keto, and JCPO is a stock. So do you think it's just providing nuclear power is out of options, or still can revive?
I think if you wanted to have a peaceful and diplomatic settlement of North Korean nuclear problem, all this nuclear energy should be integral part of our offer. Otherwise, why the hell North Korea would come up? And particularly those involved in the nuclear power in the industry in North Korea, nuclear scientists and engineers and whatever, they will be the first people who will be opposing any kind of CTL approach. Therefore, I think that in order to make the nuclear negotiation talk more meaningful and successful, the nuclear energy part should be integral part of the our incentive package to North Korea.
Okay, I ask some other current issue questions, but I know these panelists that turn off their video. If you have questions, so you can turn on video, then I can sense that you have questions after my question. Number one is, these days I sensed some kind of a cynicism but consensus in the Washington circle. Then North Korea is not going to denuclearize in any cases. So is it, cynicism? We all know that. Sometimes it's too much, this realistic cynicism kind of, inversely affect that North Korea can have, de facto or what they want is, nuclear state, treated as nuclear states. So, but very minor party that said because of the one-shot denuclearization is impossible, so it's going to take a long time. So maybe this consensus can lead to positively that we can approach this issue more step by step that North Korea wants. That's my question, Professor Chairman.
You're asking to me?
Yes. Okay. Should I repeat the question?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. I sense some kind of consensus, which is very cynical, that North Korea is not going to denuclearize at all in any cases, even though we offer something. So this cynicism is obviously, can give a wrong signal to North Korea that they can have nuclear power. Or to some people, even though it's not many people, so because one shot or denuclearization is almost impossible. So now we have to approach step by step, a long term. So can we just develop this second positive view?
The whole point is this, when you talk about all this nuclearization model, that you have so-called Pakistani model, and a lot of people say that the North Korea is, trying to follow in a Pakistani model, the Israeli model. Okay, there could be several different kinds of models of, path to, nuclear power, But in the case of North Korea may end up becoming in a Pakistani model. But whole point is this: no matter how difficult, okay, to make North Korea nuclear weapons free, okay, if we do not talk with North Korea, okay, then uncertainty will increase, okay, the chance for the nuclear escalation will be greater. Therefore, even if North Korea had such a kind of intention, it is urgently important for us to talk with North Korea, figure it out, to enhance transparency and slow the pace of North Korean steps toward full-fledged nuclear weapons power. Therefore, it doesn't matter whether North Korea has such a kind of bad intention or not. What is important is engage with North Korea, slow down the process with some incentives. And hopefully, maybe North Korea may not give up nuclear weapons without having fundamental political changes in North Korea. But what is important is this: like a JCPOA, once we have a negotiation channels, okay, if we can come up with some kinds of measures to enhance transparency, okay, that being the case, then we'll have some influence over North Korea. But if we cut up North Korea completely, don't talk, then North Korea, given judges on the past behavior, North Korea will be strengthening its nuclear arsenal, then it will be much difficult to manage the North Korean nuclear problem. Therefore, for me, regardless of North Korean intention, we got to talk with North Korea, engage North Korea, slow down the process of North Korean denuclearization process, okay? And I think that is the way we should do.
Yeah, we don't have the online question yet, but Mr. Lawrence's screen was on, so can I take that as you have a question?
Sure. I have a few questions for Professor Moon or for anybody in the room. The first one is that I, probably like all of us, have been having difficulty sorting through the different accounts of what happened at Hanoi. You mentioned this offer to dismantle Yongbyon. Do you have any sense whether the North Koreans framed that as the beginning of a process, sort of a confidence-building measure with more to come, or was this kind of seen as, did they kind of present this as the end goal? Because of course that kind of sort of, I think, changes from the American perspective what the meaning of that offer.
That's a very good question. In fact, after Kim Jong-un made the proposal, and that night, after that, President Trump left Hanoi, but in the middle of the night, North Korean Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho, convened a press conference, and he made it very clear that is just the beginning, okay? That if U.S. and North Korea can make a success in Yongbyon deal with a partial lifting of sanctions, then we'll go the second stage. Yeah. Then guess what? The Americans said that all considered HEU facility in North Korea, and Leon made it very clear we are willing to talk with about on that topic too. Therefore, the way I understand, the way our government understood at the time is very simple. That is the beginning. And if we make a successful deal here, we can move forward. We can move forward.
Yeah, one of the things that the American side has kind of lamented is that the North Koreans seem to have not wanted to talk about the nuclear issue in the lower level meetings leading up to Hanoi. And I'm just trying to get a sense of whether or not that was a bad sign. I think that's part of maybe what the American side might have been put off by, but it might also, I've also wondered whether it's just different styles of diplomacy and privileging lower level meetings versus leader to leader. I was also happy that you brought up the tritium issue, because I think that is sort of a sign that if they were willing to give up their tritium production capability, tritium has a 12-year half-life. I don't think any nuclear weapon state has ever been willing to accept the kind of limitations on nuclear weapon design that would entail. But I've written about that a little bit, but I've seen very little other commentary on that.
I think that that's a good point in the whole issue. So-called the working level versus summit talk level. In fact, the Steve Wiegand's complaint was this. During the almost 10-day, from February 16 to the February 26, Steve Wiegand was staying in Hanoi to negotiate with North Koreans at the working level. North Korea never mentioned the Yongbyon issues. Okay, therefore, according to Steve Wiegand's recent interview with the NK News, he was complaining that the North Korean negotiating, North Korean delegate didn't have any power and authority. All Kim Jong-un had power and authority. That is the reason why that South Korean government has been supporting the idea of a summit talk. That is the best way and quick way. Okay, and as the tritium issue, whole point is this. And in fact, Dr. Hacker was telling me that it is very interesting to, see that the North Korea proposed, that we have a tritium, laboratory in Yongbyon, and we are willing to dismantle it. That was a very interesting proposition on the part of North Korea.
Yeah, interesting. All right, I see that some other folks have some comments, so I'll wait. I'll hold my remaining comments. But thank you.
Okay. Here, the question from the audience came up. Professor Martin Ziegler from KAIST, North Korea's nuclear weapons arguably are a safety pill much more against China than against the US or against South Korea. What do you think?
Maybe, but in terms of threat perception, for North Koreans, the US will come up with the first, and the South Korea second, Japan third, and China fourth. But as long as there is a threat coming from United States, North Korea will be downplaying the threat coming from China, because North Korea should rely on China. Therefore, I would say that North Korea, the nominal as well as the actual reason why it is pursuing nuclear weapons is to deter American nuclear attacks. That is that is official. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I think almost ending time is up, but the last question should be mine. But you expressed your kind of frustration, I think, and as you said, I have known you for a while, for a long time. That you said that even though you are a positive person, optimistic person, but it's kind of a negative or pessimistic about breakthrough. But I cannot get away from this question because it's sensitive, about the joint military exercise issues. I think I'm always, supporter of, scaling or cancellation as long as, Korean peace process going on. And actually, President Trump promised several times complete cancellation of the exercise. But, from North Korean perspective, still going on scale down some, decapitations, exercise is still going on. That's a big deal for them. But you know what? But because Kim Yo-jong said so, you said it's preconditions. I have two questions regarding this. One is, because Kim Yo-jong said so, South Korean government is in trouble. To do that, that means order from Pyongyang, this frame. Number one, what do you think about that? And second one is, even though they said it's precondition, I don't think it's really preconditions. That means if we scale down on low key, even though we didn't cancel that, still I think it's not really obstacle or a breakdown of the whole process. So I want to ask about your opinion.
It doesn't matter who says, about the suspension of allocated joint military exercise or not, But from South Korean perspective, okay, President Moon Jae-in really wants you to transfer of what time, operational control within his, tenure, meaning by, May next year. But now it has become totally impossible for South Korea to regain wartime operational control by the time by May next year. That being the case, then hold this, joint holding of, the holding of joint exercise is not really imperative. In the past, we insist on having joint military exercise and for the purpose of the completion of transfer of wartime operational control. If that is not being the case, I think South Korean government can be more flexible. And plus, now we have a corona situation, and we are having a CPX, exercise in-house, okay, exercise. No matter how well quarantined, there is a chance of, outbreak of, contagion of, COVID-19. Therefore, from those two perspectives, maybe it might be wiser for the Aoki government to, negotiate with the U.S. government to suspend it, and let us see what North Korea can offer in kind. Okay, and therefore, it is up to the government, but I don't know what will the government, decision. But from common sense point of view, let us try it one more time. It's the last year in the government, okay? And if one of the greatest achievements of President Moon Jae-in was in the Panmunjom summit and Pyongyang summit, but no progress has been made. But for the remainder of 8 months, 8 months his tenure, he should make some successful cases. If he won it, then there must be reconsideration of this joint exercise.
Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes left. Do you have anything to add before we finish this session? So any more comments from Chairman Moon?
No, I don't have. I talked enough,
Okay, thank you very much.
By the way, did there no comments or questions from the floor?
Only Christopher Lawrence. Yeah,
Maybe.
I think they're waiting for the next session. All the panelists are preparing for the next session, I think, and maybe they agree with you on all the points. This, Biden administration, we talked about demonetization of North Korea, but I believed on relatively this Biden administration much more pragmatic. But the problem is, this new government, actually, North Korea agenda is always troublesome, hard to resolve. And the negative agenda is high risk and, low return. But we need some kind of spark, a starter. So that must come from, Korea, South Korea, Republic of Korea. And thank you very much. And, as always, it's a pleasure to listen to your speech. Thank you very much for all the audience and online too. Thank you.
Oh, bye-bye.
Thank you very much. The next session will start 10 minutes later. Thank you.
cleaner and healthier energy that the world wants. KHNP is growing with the world. A global energy company, Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power. KHNP is South Korea's largest energy company. From the first to the greatest and the best. The early challenges KHNP took on were the first steps forward to producing better energy and have now become great steps in the history of energy production. KHNP is a total energy company. Korea's largest power generation company produces 1/4 of the domestic electric power with renewable energy, such as nuclear power, hydropower, pumped storage power, solar PV, wind power, and fuel cells. KHNP has become the foundation for South Korea's economic development, enriching our lives through stable power supply. KHNP is a global energy company, a company replete with solid corporate assets, an excellent talent pool, and global recognition. By distributing advanced technology to various points around the world in need of electricity, from power plant construction to operation solutions, KHNP is positioned to become the world's leading energy company. KHNP is the leader of the future energy industry, enriching life with eco-friendly energy. KHNP continuously invests in new and renewable energy and R&D. By achieving technological innovations through integration with the Fourth Industrial Revolution, expanding its overseas business and new energy business, KHNP is preparing for a new future. KHNP pursues social values. As a leading company in the energy industry, KHNP paves the way for shared growth through collaboration and win-win growth. As a contributing member of the local community, KHNP actively provides generous support for and takes the initiative in developing the local economy, improving the living environment, and revitalizing the local culture. As a global energy leader, KHNP also strives to fulfill its roles and responsibilities abroad, beyond Korea. A total energy company that grows bigger through change and innovation. A company that constantly challenges itself for a better tomorrow. KHNP is leading the global energy industry. A trusted global energy leader, Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power.
Dr. Sang-Hyun Lee, could you kindly open the session now? You're muted. I can't hear you.
We were able to hear him online.
I'm unmuted myself. So, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well. Thank you.
All right. I just started the introduction of the panelists. So, I would like to urge each panelist to speak roughly 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, I remind you that your time is up. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Christopher Lawrence as a first panelist. Chris, could you start?
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to start off by thanking the Korea Advanced Institute for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. It's a great honor. I also see that my colleagues have prepared really interesting remarks about the prospect of nuclear energy and nuclear cooperation with North Korea going forward. And so what I'd like to do today, sorry, I guess I've forgotten to share my slides. Let's see, share screen. All right, and let's see, there we go. The Zoom buttons cover the buttons to start the slide deck. But can everybody see my slides?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to do today is to kind of briefly outline this idea of techno-diplomacy as I've written about it in this article, and kind of describe how I think it's a little bit different from the way Washington usually thinks about diplomacy, and then share some observations about the agreed framework and the Keto Light Water Reactor project as a form of techno-diplomacy. And also, a brief clarification. I'm almost always speaking to an American audience. I can see from a lot of the remarks preceding me that if I have any ideas about the North Korean nuclear crisis, then a lot of people in this room have come up with similar ideas long ago. But I do think that in Washington, there's maybe some stale thinking about this issue. So if nothing else, maybe how to engage with a Washington audience and how they frame nonproliferation diplomacy. So the ideas that I'm articulating today are just briefly summarizing what I've written about in this article on the agreed framework. I think that was sent out with the materials for the conference, but if not, feel free to reach out to me directly if you're interested. I've also written this additional piece that kind of takes some of the lessons from the agreed framework and attempts to apply them to the current challenge of engaging North Korea. So if you're interested in either of those, don't hesitate to reach out to me. All right, so as Professor Moon, I think, pointed out, there is sort of a consensus in Washington. I think a lot of analysts in the United States tend to kind of dismiss whether or not North Korea was really sort of ready or considered rolling back its nuclear program. And I want to say up front that I'm agnostic on this issue. I think that we really don't, at least from my perspective, I don't know enough about what happened at Hanoi. And even Steve Biegun, I've heard him kind of scratch his head and say we need to await the opening of the North Korean archives to really understand where North Korea was headed with its nuclear weapons program, or what other alternatives might have been possible in their minds. And I think that the goal of US policy and diplomacy with North Korea should be to earnestly probe the prospect of denuclearization while leaving our security and alliances better off, even if that prospect ultimately proves to be impossible. So then, of course, the question is, how do we do that? Like, what do I mean by probe the prospect of denuclearization? And why do I think that we haven't necessarily done that, at least in recent periods of diplomacy with North Korea? Now, American nonproliferation analysts tend to think of nonproliferation diplomacy in terms of what we call carrots and sticks. So we start off with sanctions and isolation to coerce the regime. Then we offer some rewards. These can be security assurances or economic rewards. And hopefully this shifts the incentive structure and maybe induces the regime into nuclear rollback, right? And I'm always trying to make the case that this is really the wrong way to think about nonproliferation diplomacy. Because if you think about it, if North Korea is really ever going to give up nuclear weapons, they're not going to do that for transient rewards or written promises. Rather, I think the only conceivable reason a country like North Korea would ever give up nuclear weapons would be to obtain and then preserve a different set of political relationships with the outside world, and probably principally with the United States. And so if you accept that premise, then I think it becomes pretty clear that really the only way to test the prospect of denuclearization is to offer the regime a credible path to that different set of political relationships. Now, of course, the key word here is credible. And I'll talk in a minute about how I think the structure of the North Korean nuclear crisis makes establishing the credibility of US commitments, not just North Korean commitments, but US credibility, one of the biggest challenges of engaging North Korea. And I'll also talk about the light water reactor as a way to kind of circumvent that challenge. But before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit more about these two different ways of interpreting non-proliferation crisis. And also state sort of the general policy argument that flows from my research. So I think that Washington needs to change the way it thinks about non-proliferation diplomacy. And in particular, I think we need to start thinking about US diplomatic concessions, not as ways to reward the regime for nuclear rollback, but rather as ways to demonstrate a US commitment to that changing set of political relationships by building a physical US stake in that political change. Oops, I got a little bit ahead of myself, sorry. Okay, sorry. And so that's what I mean by techno-diplomacy, because I think that the most obvious way to do that is through some form of infrastructure development in North Korea. Now, I think some of the pieces of this may have started to come together in the lead up to the Hanoi summit. So the Trump administration added what they called a fifth pillar to the Singapore statement, calling for economic development in North Korea. And of course, the Moon Jae-in administration has been proposing for a long time a series of infrastructure development projects, things like rail transit, shared energy infrastructure, that if carried out would effectively integrate North Korea into the regional and global economy in ways that would be difficult to reverse and that would fundamentally change their political relationships. But unfortunately, the steps that we need to take to pursue that kind of physical diplomacy have been blocked by US sanctions, primarily because Americans think of infrastructure development as a reward when we should be thinking in terms of confidence building. And one of the ideas that motivates my research is to suggest that these two ways of thinking about nonproliferation diplomacy, so carrots and sticks on one hand and building a credible path to political change, are essentially incommensurable with one another. In the sense that the mind kind of flips erratically back and forth, or people kind of talk past each other. And in my writing, those two articles that I just mentioned, I've outlined several important dimensions of diplomacy where these two ways of framing diplomacy offer precisely the opposite policy prescriptions. So I obviously can't step through all of those today in the time we have. But I think one of the most important ones has to do with the dimension of time. So how do we sequence the implementation of the diplomatic concessions, and how should they be arranged in time in relation to one another? Now, you can kind of see the carrot and stick prescription for this if you dig a little bit into that metaphor. Let me go back to this picture here. Now, you wouldn't, so this metaphor of carrots and sticks, you would never give a mule a carrot before it does the work, because then it won't do the work. If diplomacy is about rewarding North Korea, then obviously the US concessions need to come after denuclearization occurs. And you can see this preference in a lot of the State Department rhetoric leading up to the Hanoi summit. So here's Secretary Pompeo, who was fond of saying that the path to a secure and prosperous future for North Korea leads through the gate of denuclearization. So here the time sequence is pretty obvious. You know, you start off with sanctions, then you step through the gate of denuclearization, and then you will see the rewards. And this is the message that we've been sending to North Korea for many years, but we don't ever talk about the credibility of that path. And until we establish that credibility, we're not going to be able to effectively probe any conditional willingness that the regime may have to roll back its nuclear weapons program. Alternatively, if diplomatic concessions are not rewards, but rather costly signals about commitment to a different political future, then each diplomatic concession speaks about the future and sets the stage for the next set of denuclearization steps. And I think this alternative time structure is implied in some of Moon Jae-in's language when he talks about a virtuous cycle between infrastructure investment and denuclearization. But the idea that I'm trying to get across here is that these two ways of framing diplomacy are incommensurable with one another. And I think that's part of why people are often talking past each other when they're debating what happened at Hanoi. All right, so why would credibility be the main challenge to engaging North Korea, and in particular, US credibility? Well, if what North Korea is really after is a different set of political relationships, then that obviously involves long-term commitments on the part of the US to stick to those political changes indefinitely into the future. But at the same time, I think it's abundantly clear that really the only reason the US has engaged with North Korea to begin with is because of their nuclear weapons capabilities. So if North Korea were to irreversibly give up those capabilities in exchange for written commitments on the part of the US to stick to some political change going forward, why would the regime expect the US to follow through on those commitments once they had given up what has proven to be their only source of bargaining leverage? So international relations scholars in the room may recognize this as what's known as a commitment problem, or a situation in which a mutually preferable bargain is unobtainable because one or more sides would later have an incentive to renege on the terms. This is James Fearon's definition. So note here again the dimension of time. It's not the present incentive structure that precludes a bargain. Both sides in the present may prefer a bargain to their current standoff. Rather, it's the foreseeable change in that incentive structure down the road that makes a commitment at t equals 0 impossible to credibly express. And in my research on the history of US engagement with North Korea, I've outlined how this commitment problem structure has really been at the heart of the North Korean nuclear crisis ever since the early 90s. And I think that if we're really serious about trying to overcome this dilemma, that we really need to come up with some alternative infrastructure of mutual leverage and shared interest to offset the forfeitures and bargaining leverage that North Korea would be making with each nuclear rollback step. Of course, that means ceding some leverage to North Korea, but that's what I think is needed. And so that's really the essence of the diplomatic approach to nonproliferation diplomacy. And I think that historically, it's best exemplified in the Keto Light Water Reactor project of the Agreed Framework. So everybody here knows the Agreed Framework. I'll just briefly state that I think so obviously the heart of the Agreed Framework was this reactor trade, whereby North Korea agreed to freeze and slowly dismantle its plutonium production reactors. And alongside this, a US-led consortium would build 2 large Western light water reactors in North Korea. Now, under the traditional way of thinking about nonproliferation diplomacy, we look back at these reactors as a carrot. You know, the intrinsic value of the energy generation capability is what's at stake. But I think we should be looking at these reactors in terms of confidence building, because when you look at the negotiating history of the Agreed Framework, you see that, lo and behold, what was a big part of what was really at stake in those negotiations was this idea of normalization and a different political future, and that prospect suffered from the same credibility challenges that I just mentioned. And if you look further at the technical aspects of the light water reactor project and what it would have physically taken to build and operate large Western reactors north of the DMZ, then you can start to see the reactor project itself as a way to build the physical embodiment of that changed political relationship, because that's essentially what it would have amounted to. So the once-through light water reactor fuel cycle is one of the most globalized technologies in existence. It inevitably brings reactor technology, it inevitably brings reactor operating countries into these international networks of technical collaboration. So things like fuel supply, in-core reactor fuel management, safety and liability. And due to the long lives of these reactors and the kind of technological inertia associated with them, the political relationships that attend these forms of collaboration tend to be a bit more sticky than those associated with other forms of energy generation technology. And again, I have to refer to my writing in the interest of time. I've listed several technical aspects of light water reactors that at the time seemed to make this possible. Happy to discuss those in the Q&A. But what I really want to cover or go back to before I run out of time is this dimension of time issue. So if the commitment problem is this time-based dilemma, then how was a reactor project structured to circumvent that or to address that credibility issue in time? Well, if you look at the light water reactor supply agreement, you see that what they did is they took the most time irreversible steps toward denuclearization in North Korea, and they spread those out across time. So time here is in the down direction. These blue boxes here each represent a step toward denuclearization that would be difficult to reverse one way or another. And those were to be synchronized with the most costly and time irreversible steps in the light water reactor construction process. And what's interesting
Chris, could you wrap up in 1 minute?
Okay. Okay, so what's interesting about this is that none of these steps alone would have rewarded North Korea because nobody benefits from a half-built reactor. Rather, each pair of these synchronized steps had the potential to function as an exchange of costly signals, indicating both sides' willingness to continue down this path, and moreover, incrementally shifting the incentive structure in favor of taking the next pair of steps. So this is what I call arrow of time diplomacy. What I think is happening here is that negotiators were leveraging time irreversible physical processes on the ground in North Korea as bargaining chips. They were then arranging those steps into a sequence that, if followed, physically takes us to that different political reality. So at the end of the day, we can say what we will about the credibility of written commitments. If you bolt two of these things to the ground in North Korea, and North Korea's political relationships with the outside world are de facto different. So that's this kind of arrow of time techno-diplomacy idea. I have some thoughts about lessons learned. It looks like, so I've looked at some of North Korea's nuclear behavior, and it looks like it has correlated with the political and financial status of the Keto project. I guess I have to wrap up here, but basically my sort of parting argument is that the agreed framework was working. The evidence suggests that the Keto project indeed functioned as this kind of costly signal to influence North Korea's long-term decision-making. And at the same time, North Korea ever since has been pretty immune to transit rewards, carrots and sticks, and written promises. So I think if we sort of think about infrastructure development as a way to build the physical embodiment of some political future, then that's maybe a way forward for how to think about engaging North Korea. And I'm sorry I had to rush my comments in the interest of time, and I look forward to the discussion about what nuclear energy would look like today in North Korea.
Well, thank you, Chris. We will follow up your argument in the discussion later in the later session. Okay. Next panelist, Toby Dalton. Could you start?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, fine.
Good. So just let me share my screen. Well, it's great to be back at the NEREC conference again. I've always enjoyed the opportunity to interact with the other panelists and, of course, the participants, and regret that we couldn't be with you in person this year, but hopefully soon. So following from Chris's presentation, today I want to talk a little bit kind of looking ahead to the potential for nuclear cooperation or other forms of cooperative threat reduction during denuclearization of North Korea, and to highlight some of the issues and politics that I see coming from those. Let me just advance my slides. So I'm going to cover what I think are some prevailing US beliefs that I think were also made clear in Chris's presentation, and some of the implications, especially as they apply to the political realities of attempting to do cooperative threat reduction. I also want to talk about what I see as some of the technical realities of trying to do that during a very complex denuclearization process, and then what are the implications for cooperative threat reduction and other kinds of cooperation. And then I'll close with a parting shot on the issue of North Korea's right to nuclear energy, which I think Sharon is going to dive further into in her presentation. So in terms of the prevailing beliefs or preferences that we see in US politics as it applies to the North Korea policy challenge, basically for any US administration to reach an agreement, they will have to overcome several predominant views of the North Korea problem that exist both within the national security bureaucracy, but also within Congress. And Chris highlighted the nonproliferation view of the problem, which is that ultimately, maximum pressure will reverse North Korea's nuclear problem, and then we could deliver rewards. I think many people still view North Korea as a non-proliferation problem rather than as an arms control or some other type of problem. I think it's also worth suggesting that there are many people who think that North Korea is on the verge of imminent collapse, and that to enter into any kind of deal with Kim Jong-un is a fool's errand and just wasted money, and we should just wait out this problem. And those kinds of fantasies are still very prevalent, particularly in Congress and in some of the commentariat as well. And that makes it very difficult, I think, for any administration to overcome the politics of reaching a denuclearization agreement and then implementing it to include through use of tools like cooperative threat reduction. These aren't the only beliefs that shape US policy, but I think they're important ones. There are other important ones too that I think are important to highlight, particularly when it comes to how funding might be associated with cooperative threat reduction. And that is that I think many members of Congress will oppose any deal with North Korea and would probably not want to put any money into any kind of implementation program associated with the deal. And this is for a variety of reasons. Some, I think, view North Korea as a sort of foreign policy free lunch, which basically, in my view, is that they see this as a way to look tough without having any real domestic or foreign policy consequences. But I think that you also see other elements too, which is that we tried to buy this program once through the agreed framework. That failed. We'd be suckers if we tried to buy it again, and like arguments that will make it quite difficult. So what are some of the consequences and policy framing implications then of these prevailing beliefs and preferences? First, as we've seen before, I think it would be manifestly the case that cheating will be a dominant concern, and there's always going to be a political narrative that we can't trust North Korea. They're going to cheat on any agreement that we sign with them, and therefore it's again a fool's errand to try to negotiate with them. Related to that is that it will be very difficult to prove the absence of cheating. North Korea is famously described as an intelligence black hole. There's going to be lots of gray area in any agreement that would be signed with respect to the activities that would be permitted or not permitted and what might constitute non-compliance with an agreement. And therefore, the government is going to be put in a position of having to make very complex and politically charged compliance determinations, which inevitably get very messy politically on Capitol Hill. I think it's also likely to be the case that there will be strong risk aversity in the national security bureaucracy, particularly in agencies that would be charged with implementing cooperative threat reduction programs in North Korea. They do not want to be in the position of being seen as inadvertently aiding a weapons program or somehow advancing a covert hedging capability that would allow North Korea to break out of the agreement, or to do things that would somehow attract congressional investigation. So I think that risk aversity is going to be an impediment to delivering on the kinds of promises that an administration would need to put on the table to reach an agreement. And then related to that, there's a view in Congress, it was certainly the case with the cooperative threat reduction programs with Russia, and I think would be the case here too, that that framing of threat reduction, of actually reducing the threat to the United States and allies, really only avoids the perception that what we're doing is providing aid to North Korea, as rewarding them for having proliferated. And I think that perception, we can go so far perhaps with threat reduction activities, but only to a point. And so then at the bottom line of that is, what would Congress be willing to fund? It's really, I think, clear that there's no problem in Congress to fund a war. But when it comes time to fund peace, oftentimes the money is in short supply or comes with a lot of strings attached, and it's very difficult to deliver. And it will also be clear, as it is in the case of the Iran agreement, that there will be members of Congress who are looking to grandstand and will oppose any agreement on principle and do everything they can to tear it apart. As a slight footnote on the Trump administration's diplomacy, I think it did not attract a lot of criticism from Capitol Hill among Republicans, but privately, if you would talk to members and staff, they really did not favor that diplomacy, and it would have put them in a really difficult position had the Trump administration delivered an agreement that then they were asked to fund in some way. So if I think about then the kinds of plausible cooperative threat reduction activities that might be pursued, I tried to come up with a rank ordering based on sort of how they would be viewed within the bureaucracy and perhaps also on Capitol Hill in terms of level of interest or willingness to fund or engage in these things. Obviously, if it was a matter of capping the arsenal and dismantling weapons and production infrastructure, it's easier to imagine that money would be forthcoming for an activity like that. But as you go down this list that I've put here, once you start to get into things where it starts to look more like a reward to North Korea, and this goes back to the nonproliferation framing of the problem that Chris described, then I think the politics of this become much more challenging. And so when you get into assistance, whether it's science and technology engagement or, much further and more sort of big picture, if you were to actually try to do nuclear energy cooperation, I think there's going to be a lot of opposition to that. And it would be very difficult to get Congress to fund something like that. So in terms of the work that's been done, NTI had a very good report called Building Security Through Cooperation that looked at a range of cooperative threat reductions that could be done. Most of those were focused on WMD elimination. And ultimately, I think realistically, those are going to be the most difficult things to actually negotiate and implement, and therefore much later in a phased denuclearization process. Much less sensitive or easier activities to implement, such as working on nuclear safety or environmental remediation or things like that, I think they're unlikely to satisfy North Korea. Probably not going to get a lot of support in Congress. But when you think about how a lengthy process might carry out, are actually the kinds of steps that early on could build some confidence in established relationships between the technical cadres in North Korea with outside partners. So how do those political realities then match to some of the technical realities? It's clear to me that if denuclearization were to happen over a very long period of time and kind of according to whatever roadmap would be followed, North Korea would possess during that process both nuclear weapons and components and probably all of the infrastructure needed to produce them for quite a long time. And that is an infrastructure that has cohered to produce nuclear weapons. It is not dual use. And so there's no clear separation of non-weapons oriented facilities or activities, and in which you could then say, okay, that facility or location or this particular activity is not associated with the nuclear weapons program and therefore is okay for engagement and to use for peaceful purposes. I think that is a real barrier to thinking about how you would go into the more sort of carrots side of cooperative threat reduction. It's also the case, and I'm going to dive into this a little bit more in my next slide, that North Korea is going to hedge against implementation failures, both with weapons and materials, but probably also the capability to reconstitute any infrastructure that is disabled or dismantled during implementation. We saw that in the six-party talks period. We've seen that in other cases too. I think Iran is a good example of that. There's no reason to think that North Korea wouldn't do that. In fact, I think they would be silly not to hedge. And so we need to plan for that both politically and technically. Yet, that does create real technical, organizational, legal, and political challenges for considering what kind of cooperation or assistance would be delivered during denuclearization. And so then we need to think through, okay, what phases of denuclearization would certain types of assistance make more sense? And how do you begin to introduce separation in the elements of the program that could be more clearly hived off so that they're not associated with weapons anymore? And some of that really may involve new infrastructure, not old. Oh, why did that happen? I'm so sorry. Let me try that again. I was just humming along nicely. All right. So what about cooperation and hedging further? So if North Korea is unlikely to declare its entire infrastructure, let alone cease work or dismantle it for some period of time, how do we think then about the kinds of issues that flow from that? We're going to see things in the missile area to include an interest in retaining missiles for conventional military purposes and potentially for space exploration and utilization purposes. We know that there's an interest in fuel cycle, either for research and energy purposes. We're likely to see R&D also that could be supporting weapons reconstitution. And a lot of these kinds of capabilities, I think it's likely that North Korea would try to retain or even replace under the guise of peaceful activities, but are going to be very difficult to disassociate from the potential for covert capability. And so then that puts the burden on North Korea's implementing partners, the US and South Korea and others. What activities would be comfortable to us to be permitted, in quotations, during different phases of denuclearization implementation, and under what kinds of transparency conditions, understanding North Korea's long-established reticence to allow on-site inspections and other kinds of more intrusive means. So how to cooperate with or assist with the rollback to dual-use capabilities and ensure non-diversion so that we're not subsidizing covert activity, I think is going to be a real problem. And then the monitoring associated with that is also a real issue. My colleague George Perkovich and I have highlighted a few of these things in a paper that we wrote last year for Lawrence Livermore National Lab called Thinking the Other Unthinkable, Disarmament in North Korea and Beyond. And I would point to some verification related work that Carnegie recently published, an edited volume that looks at some novel approaches to how you could begin to verify and monitor a range of capabilities far in excess of what's been done in North Korea previously. All right, so what are the implications for CTR planners? I'm just wrapping up here. So I think that the technical and political realities that I've laid out should shape and certainly not prevent negotiations and really force planners within the government to think through some tough questions and choices, thinking about how they can insulate this process against the likelihood of failure. That means thinking about how these activities relate to the end game. Whatever the end game is, it's going to take a long time to get there. The CTR model, in Russia, it started with some very different premises. There was never any question that Moscow was going to continue to have nuclear weapons. CTR was a means of helping it implement arms control, arms reduction treaty commitments, and to secure fissile materials. A lot of the transparency and access was built into that by virtue of having a long record of treaty inspections. In North Korea, we're going to have to create this entire edifice out of whole cloth. There is going to need to be an established linkage between the roadmaps of phased denuclearization and the assistance to achieve it, along with the permissible activity and the incentive to shift away from denuclearization and the transparency that comes with that. That is a really difficult set of linkages to figure out how to arrange. I think Chris's side-by-side on the agreed framework is a good example. The situation is just much more complicated now. How do you think about managing hedging and transparency? We would be silly to think that North Korea wouldn't hedge. We're going to hedge as well, just as South Korea should hedge in a variety of ways. And it's insurance against cheating, it's deterrence against failure. And so thinking about managing that hedging, I think is an important thing, and figuring out how to channel that hedging into certain capabilities so that other things become available to roll back, disable, dismantle, etc., I think is going to be necessary. And that brings to mind then the arms control type of analogies that I think are more useful to thinking about that that type of process, how to phase the cooperation and assistance given the likelihood of hedging, and then circling back to where I started, how can we drag Congress along and make sure that there continues to be some minimum coalition that will support and fund the activities to actually see the long-term commitment through that would be needed to reach the end result of denuclearization. All right, my last slide, and this is just a kind of a parting thought on relitigating rights, because this panel was framed in terms of how should we consider North Korea's right to nuclear energy. It's very clear, reading back through prior agreements, that they stipulated or at least acknowledged North Korea's assertion of a right to peaceful nuclear activity. North Korea sees itself as a state with nuclear weapons. They have, commonly compared themselves to India and want the same kind of arrangement that India got. And I think trying to refute that or deny that at the outset would be foolish from a negotiating standpoint. It would be a distraction to the negotiations and is unlikely to create an environment where you could actually make progress. So rather than attempting to deny this right, it's probably better to think about how you could focus on shaping how North Korea decides to exercise that right. And so that presents some interesting questions. Should we rehabilitate or replace, for instance, the IRT reactor? What do you do about the experimental light water reactor that hasn't come online yet? We see potential lessons from the JCPOA there with the conversion of the Arak heavy water reactor. I think those are things that we should start to think about early and channel the discussion on how North Korea exercises rights in those directions, even if we have to punt on the sort of big, are we going to build LWRs again in North Korea? If we have to punt on that question for a little bit, still here, I think it's important to recognize that North Korea is going to have a nuclear program of some sort.
Hey,
and we want to push it into more useful directions. So the goal should be to facilitate peaceful uses in ways that are more likely to deliver benefits to North Korean people, rather than trying to refuse on principle, because that's just going to make the desired outcomes that we want to achieve unreachable. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you. Okay, next panelist, Hyunding Lee from Fudan University. Hyunding Lee, could you start?
Thank you. I thank NEREC conference to bring me back. We're addressing the issue, can North Korea have nuclear energy? The answer is yes. The reason is all acknowledged nuclear weapon states are not banned for nuclear energy. China, US can have nuclear energy. Second, all non-acknowledged nuclear weapon states are not banned to build their indigenous nuclear energy program. They are not expected or even banned to access external resource for their domestic nuclear energy program. But the world has not banned all countries who are able to help, not to help such non-acknowledged nuclear weapon state. Especially the NSG has allowed all countries who are able to help India. India is an unacknowledged nuclear weapon state. And the US has made it way, the door open for India. And the US has not banned Israel for its nuclear weapon. And China views the US move is apparently having a geostrategic effect. So China is determined to do similar things for Pakistan. China claimed that before it joined NSG, it already has committed some nuclear energy program transfer to Pakistan. So the grandson should not restrict the grandfather. but the world never knows how many grandsons China has bared between itself and Pakistan. So all this country keeps enjoying this nuclear weapon state, not recognized by NPT. They keep enjoying international cooperation for their domestic nuclear energy. And no one has sanctioned China for such a behavior, or sanctioned the US, especially the US move has been approved by NSG. But NSG is a coalition of the willing. Anyone who is unwilling to join NSG may safely stay outside of the NSG. The UN has not passed any enforceable sanctioning platform to sanction those who committed to stay outside of the NSG to assist those non-acknowledged nuclear weapon state. So this is a legal situation that we are facing. That means North Korea can have nuclear energy. Second, how to address this issue? Whether North Korea has nuclear energy and also have nuclear weapon. That is not acknowledged. This is what China has said. Having both fish and a bear pond, you can have both nice stuff at one time. And India succeeded in attaining both. Pakistan succeeded in attaining both without being punished for having nuclear energy importation from China. And China is not punished. And everybody knows it is not for nuclear energy. India can flourish very well without its nuclear energy. And Pakistan can do the same. China is spending some 50 billion US dollar in Pakistan in few years for CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. That does not have nuclear energy. That's far more money than China's transfer of its nuclear energy technology to Pakistan. So facing this situation, how we can probe? In my view, we already see the outcome of the probe. That is, all those countries I have mentioned are committed not to abandon nuclear weapons, at least for now, and probably forever. Second, we really do not have an option, a non-diplomatic option, or techno-diplomatic action choice to reverse them. After India and Pakistan each tested their nuclear weapons, in later 1990, the US proposed a three-phase approach to them, which is capping, freezing, and reversing. And more than 20 years after that, we see no capping. They are building up more stockpile for nuclear weapons. And probably is building up more nuclear weapon arsenals. And probably are doing both at one time. And they still have some international friends, US to India, China to Pakistan, etc. Under this circumstance, collapsing is an unreachable dream. India would not collapse. Without the US and American, Western country, Russian friendship, India would not collapse. And with their friendship, India would develop better. And also, I don't think without China's cooperation, I do not mean in nuclear area, but in generic term, Pakistan and North Korea would collapse. Expecting strategic pensions do nothing, expect them to collapse, would only meet more frustration. Because we know the bottom. We do not need to probe anymore. We don't need to cheat ourselves. They are unwilling to abandon nuclear weapons. Whether China would abandon, whether the US would abandon, would any of them be more foolish than the US and China? No. But why South Korea would not develop? First, South Korea used to develop. Second, despite the US force deploying in South Korea still does not trust the US would develop. Third, after US threatened, then South Korea reluctantly abandoned. I'm not sure if it's a genuine abandonment or it's a half story. So US had to assure South Korea, Taiwan, Japan again and again that don't do, because Uncle Sam would back you. China foolishly sanctioned North Korea. That hurts North Korea to think China is not a reliable ally. North Korea is the only ally to China on the paper. Pakistan is not. Pakistan requested legal alliance that was refused by China. But China joined six-party talk or initiated six-party talk, pressurized North Korea, that only lead to the worst case, that is, a more determined North Korea that believe that as long as it has nuclear weapon, it can survive. And so far, it's true. Their bet is right. And China has to meet with Kim Jong-un 4 times a year, I mean my top leader. Once it saw that partially due to China's suppression of North Korea could be a certain kind of partner of the US. North Korea would really embark on nuclear denuclearization process. China is scared. China quickly took a diplomatic initiative to defeat the US. Come back, I would help you. So North Korea knows China sanctioned North Korea not wholeheartedly. China just want to get both fish in a bare palm, to get a face with the US, to have a better China-US trade relationship. But meantime, pay a cost of hurting China-US North Korean relationship as a cost. But China never wants North Korea to collapse. China would do everything possible to support the regime. That's the purpose that China did in 1950. And we created a security zone between the US stationing South Korea and China. And today, you know, geographically, it's not necessary. But if North Korea is still there, that would double China's security confidence. China-US can wage a war without North Koreans serving as a buffer. But if North Korea would be there, that only helps China, that would not harm China. So if the US keeps sanctioning North Korea, China would sanction North Korea. That would push North Korea to feel nobody is credible, is trustful. So I need to do independent program of both nuclear weapon and nuclear energy. And once they saw they get no reversal of U.S. hostile position from Trump, then they would keep building up their relationship with China. So this kind of non-trustful China-North Korean relationship would never help North Korea to feel they have alternative security. And even though their relationship with China today is warmer, they still do not trust China. They are determined to keep a nuclear weapon or abandon partial program for political economic purpose, but in the meantime to keep other part or to initiate some new clandestine program. That has led to the collapse of the Hanoi summit between North Korea and the US. War is not a feasible approach because North Korea is China's ally to attack North Korea when US has fury and fire. Then US would push China to be tested. At a time when China-US is gaming regionally, globally, China does not want to lose its own, the last remaining credibility to help North Korea or not. So President Trump eventually think he would not repeat his argument. All options are on the table, theoretically, but politically, there is one option which is not on the table, which is war. So diplomatic choice is a choice when you have no other choice. Therefore, it is not a choice. When you have a choice of war, you have a choice of diplomacy. When you have fear, one Hiroshima bomb can take away 100,000 lives instantly, and possibly North Korea's rudimentary nuclear weapon can have that kind of reach. They may not be.
Certainly. Could you wrap up in 1 minute?
Okay. In conclusion, war is not an option. Then diplomacy cannot be a real option. But that still can serve a purpose, not to increase the stockpile of North Korea. But we have to take the harder reality to live with the current stockpile. And even for this, we have to pay a cost. One, not to expect North Korea to do all in the first place, and the US would return with all measures. We have to do phased program, not one program. Second, without US-China to reach a realistic compromise globally, when US is reaching out for allies, China would reach out for allies. The allies are Russia, Pakistan, North Korea. And the US has India, Japan, and Australia. So you have your regional security grouping, we have our regional security grouping. So this is a hard reality. I am not optimistic even now for parallel, partial, phased nuclear reduction. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Well, because of the time, we are already behind the schedule. So let me invite Dr. John Bong-gun as the next panelist.
Hello, good to see you all. I'm very glad to see all the faces and the new faces. And also, I'd like to express my thanks and congratulations to KAIST NEREC program. It's going well, and I also learned a lot. This is my topic, the lessons from Kido case. In fact, I think that this morning and this session is all about past North Korean denuclearization diplomacy. So Kido issue already came up, and the CTR came up from the very beginning by the speech of Moon Jae-in. But I will very briefly mention about what is Kido. All of us know Kido very well, but when I ask young students, most of them don't. And so, secondly, why Kido failed? We all know, but I just want to go back to my own personal experience. So why it could not succeed, and what are the effects of Kido project? What kind of significance we could get from Kido project? And does the DPRK need nuclear energy? There is always a kind of alternative to the DPRK. Why don't we provide just other, fossil fuel plants or anything else, just a direct power line? But as was mentioned also today, the DPRK was thinking of nuclear hedging. And do we need another Kido? My answer at this point is, yeah, I think we need one, but it's quite pessimistic also. But I think in order to solve the DPRK nuclear problem, we need a very comprehensive solution, and the provision of nuclear power plant should be one. In that case, Kido is the best example that we could refer to. And Kido was, as we all know, that was possible because of this 1994 US DPRK agreed framework. But here I just want to emphasize that, of course, we all know that Kido was established to provide two nuclear reactors and half tons of heavy fuel oil to the DPRK. But here I want to just emphasize that Kido was very slow in fulfilling its obligations, especially providing nuclear power plants. In the originally agreed framework said that we are going to provide 2003 nuclear power plants. Of course, it shows it had. We knew that it's going to be very difficult. We inserted the target date. It was an excuse for us being late, but I mean, it was too late. And also, we couldn't really provide heavy fuel oil, pending this provision of nuclear power plant. We have provided 500,000 tons of heavy fuel oil, but we never really provided this heavy fuel oil on time because of a lack of funds. Always there is a lot of improvisation and begging around to find the financial, finance to buy these funds. And of course, the DPRK was never ready to receive. They didn't have such a huge oil tank, empty oil tank, and the function oil tank to receive our heavy fuel oil. And in the middle, I said that here is a year of 2000. What does it mean? When we are about to have this arranging provision of this nuclear power plant, we learned that KEPCO cannot really seriously begin building nuclear power plants until, for us, Kido too, until we have a full financial arrangement. Kido, in fact, could not make arrangement. We are going to buy nuclear power plant from KEPCO and providing it to DPRK, but we are lacking of funds. Korea was supposed to provide 70%. Japan was supposed to provide up to 1 billion. Still, we are in short of about 1 billion. without money, we cannot buy it. So, but finally, it's just some promises from the U.S. U.S. will be responsible to fulfill the remaining fund. So we could finally made really a turnkey contract with our prime contract, Capco. That was 2000. That was about 6 years behind from the starting point of agreed framework. And the DPRK used to make fun of us that if you are going in this schedule, it's going to take about 30 years or so. But after having this prime contract of 2000, the construction was seriously accelerated. But even before that, from 1995 to 2000, around 5 years, we begin our preliminary construction work already. So we are digging, hole there, but we didn't really do any significant manufacturing work or anything else. But from the very beginning, it was very controversial. We all know that, especially in the U.S. Congress. They were, especially Republicans, didn't like it. All of them are kind of tried to stigmatize that the agreed framework was a surrender paper to the document. So always there was a kind of stigma there. And also, U.S. governmental delegation, knowing that it's going to be not accepted by the U.S. Congress, they just openly said that. But this Kido project is only to buy time until the DPRK collapses. So while the project was going on, while the agreement was going on, but political atmosphere was somewhat less than satisfactory. Then why Kido failed? In fact, as I worked at the Kido project for about 3 years. I was stationed in New York office, so I could travel to the DPRK about 10 times, during those years. And when I finished my Kido, mission, my work there in early 2001, I knew that time, though there was a very much acceleration of a construction work and the manufacturing, and there was a full contract, everything looks good. But on the other hand, I saw there is a lot of big structural problems. Without solving them, all of them have a full potential to disrupt this Kido project. So I wrote an article when I returned to Korea that the obstacles to Kido LWR project. This title looks very neutral, but I try to send a very serious warning to both ROK and the U.S. government. If you just take this handoff position, it's going to come to a really head on clash with a big war that it's going to be stopped. Previously, one of our panelists mentioned that this Kido was a political techno project. I 100% agree. I also defined that at the time that this is a political project. But politically, it was not popular. It was popular only in South Korea. It was never popular in the U.S. So in the DPRK, they tried to make it as just a technical project. What the U.S. do is just managing things. They just doesn't want to involve the politics anymore. So here I wrote at the time, 2001, the fact that the LWR project is now well underway doesn't guarantee that smooth implementation to the end. Many uncertainties resulting from the unique nature of DPRK and this project was loom large. Therefore, the pace of a project or completion of project is subject to how quickly these uncertainties, political, financial, non-proliferation, legal, these obstacles are reduced and being handled. But the issue was there, but the government never took that as a political issue. And also I pointed out that there is a 4 major group of obstacles that need to be handled. One is DPRK cooperation or non-cooperation with the project. While we are directly talking to the DPRK and bringing and doing things, all of them to the DPRK something very new. They are not ready to it. There are so many examples. For example, just one, if I take one example, in order to have a construction worker, we need to have a communication line between site and the CAPCO headquarters in Seoul. So knowing DPRK has a very poor, communication line, we said that we need to use a satellite. DPRK at first agreed on that, so we are really about to proceed that. DPRK said that it's going to hurt their, telecommunication sovereignty. They said that then they're not going to allow it. So we have to use DPRK communication line. It took so much money. It was so slow, and also non-proliferation obligations. At the beginning, just digging soil, that's okay. But when we are about to deliver a significant parts of LWR, DPRK should be in compliance with the NPT or any other non-proliferation obligations. But the DPRK delayed, and we couldn't see DPRK was keeping their promises and the readiness to receive the LWR project. One example was that when we are about to having contract and buy major parts from suppliers in the South Korea, in the US, especially in the US, General Electric, for example, said that we need a full immunity from US and the Korean government. Only then we could provide the nuclear components. We know that the DPRK cannot, if there is any accident, DPRK cannot cover the cost of damage to the accident and any liability problem. So they need a full immunity from Korea and the US government. But by law, Korea and the US government cannot provide any immunity. What's happening in the DPRK? That's causing serious problem. And the DPRK tried to solve their own liability problem by making their own laws on liability and buying insurance. But no one in the world was ready to sell liability insurance to the reinsurance to the DPRK, because the DPRK was having such a low state credit. And finally, support from Kido executive board members. We know that when we had some problem with the DPRK, submarine was found on our own coast. We asked the DPRK to apologize. Without it, we said that we want to stop the project. And also, US may have the same problem. And finally, and the DPRK and also US was stop the project. So we need continuous support. But the problem was that all of these problems, though it's just one slide, it was such a big problem. And all of them, and each one of them have potential to destroy the whole project. And also the most difficult problem was that some of these problems cannot be overcome unless the nature of the DPRK state and leadership changes. Then what are the effects of the Kido project? To end the first North Korean nuclear crisis, that is good. And the great experiment of nuclear for nuclear. It looks successful, but didn't last long. And also, inter-Korean exchange was greatly expanded. I could say that without this, there was no Gyeonggang Mountain project, no Kaesong Industry project, probably no Kim Dae-jung, Kim Jong-il inter-Korean summit. Kido was such a project that could make so many South Koreans could visit the DPRK, and we could invite the DPRK people to come to South Korea for technical training. And also there was another very important factor that North Korea is opening to an engagement to the world. We are engaging with the DPRK, and the DPRK expressed its own willingness to engage with the South Korea, US, and the world. And also, we could get, for the first time, could collect the first-hand in-depth information on North Korea. Probably, I think, at least thousands of South Korean officials, and also Americans too, Japanese too, could get visit the DPRK using the Kido hat. And also Western countries opened embassies in Pyongyang. And does the DPRK need nuclear energy?
So could you wrap up in 1 minute?
Yeah, I try to shorten. And I think they want to have it for a long time. They are shortage of any other energy resources. And also they are have some hedging in mind. They want to retain technical nuclear experts and the facilities and the capabilities while they are converting to peaceful use of nuclear energy. Certain DPRK needs nuclear energy and also these things. Finally, do we need another Kido? I think we need to provide, if we really want to have really serious nuclear rollback in North Korea, we need to provide the nuclear energy. That's what the DPRK wanted. And there is a couple of reasons. They are strong interest in nuclear energy for decades. And also their desire in their identity as a kind of self-independence and self-help. So only nuclear energy could give them some energy independence. And the DPRK's strategy of hatching of nuclear for nuclear. And probably, and that's what I think we need to have that. That's why I want to say that whenever we are going to have any denuclearization roadmap with the DPRK, it should be in this right bottom corner. I was saying that the LWR provision, it should be our overall package of denuclearization by the DPRK. And without it, it's going to be very difficult to have that. I think I better stop here, and I'll be ready to take any questions about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I'm sorry for not giving you enough time. Next panelist is Sharon Scassoni. Sharon, could you start?
Sorry. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Can everyone see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up.
Yes, looks fine.
Yeah, fantastic. All right. I titled my presentation, How to Have Nuclear Power in North Korea, not whether it can, because I think we need to bow to realities. Realistically, whatever arms control or denuclearization or nonproliferation agreement we have with North Korea, I don't think that banning nuclear energy is going to be in the cards. So really what we need to talk about is how much nuclear energy, who pays for it and inspects it, and who collaborates. And I know as Bangun Jun has given an excellent presentation on Kido, that multilateral nature of Kido is very important, particularly because the US found it very difficult to finance some of this. But as we look, I know some of this conference is looking more broadly at nuclear energy. There's a competition there too. I know Shending Ling was very candid with us. There is a competition in nuclear energy, and the kind of, if you want to call it techno diplomacy, or how we use nuclear cooperation to gain leverage is very much out there. But there are some, it's important to remember the proliferation context and precedents, which influence the answers to these 4 questions. So just briefly, I wanted to explain, why is nuclear energy in North Korea a foregone conclusion? Because the experimental light water reactor, it's been under construction since 2009. The longer we wait, there will likely be additional efforts that follow. We don't have a lot of information about that reactor. We can see things, from above. When I was in the DPRK in 2011, there was not a lot of information they were willing to share. Obviously, North Korea needs electricity. It is mostly dependent on coal and hydropower. But we face this with Quito also, some of the grid issues, how do you extend transmission and distribution of electricity are going to complicate how we cooperate, if we do cooperate with them. Whether you call this denuclearization as in the example of South Africa, or non-proliferation as in the example of Iran, doesn't, to my mind, matter so much. Those are precedents, and they're important precedents. And I believe that North Korea has watched pretty closely what Iran has done. We have a series of papers that we produce at GW. And of course, finally, the precedent of Quito. All right. In denuclearization, South Africa is really only the only one true precedent for denuclearization, a country that had a stockpile and dismantled it. They dismantled the weapons. They dismantled the enrichment plant at Falendaba. They recast the high enriched uranium. They sent it to storage, and they repurposed the Falendaba Nuclear Research Center. We could spend a week talking about how South Africa did it and why, and whether we are satisfied with what we did, but that's the outcome. Okay, so there were certain elements left over. In Iran, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, I see parallels there with the agreed framework, in that the JCPOA, like the agreed framework, supplemented the inspections and monitoring under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. They had to. Why? Because what was happening in Iran and North Korea wasn't enough. And this is a point that people, all the non-proliferation diplomats in the world will never say this, but I'm here to say it because I'm not in the government anymore. The NPT is not enough. And that is something that, because it doesn't contain restrictions on enrichment and reprocessing, and that is a bridge we're going to have to cross. So the JCPOA had new restrictions on enrichment, reprocessing, provided a little bit of assistance on modifying the Arak reactor, and I have a few suggestions for what we can do with North Korea. In lesser cases of proliferation, and we could name them: Argentina, Brazil, countries in South Korea, Taiwan, countries that had elements of a military program. In all of those cases, it was necessary to curtail or even eliminate sensitive fuel cycle capabilities to maximize what we now talk about as breakout time, right? Time to a bomb. So this is a critical point that I would love everybody to take away from this, right? It's one thing to say, yeah, you can have a light water reactor. Another thing to leave a country with enrichment and reprocessing capabilities. As we can see from Iran, I'm not sure we're going to have much of a choice with North Korea on the enrichment end of it. Okay, here are the reasons pro for leaving, or for accepting North Korea, or why we should feel good about North Korea with nuclear energy. I'm a skeptic on the whole climate change. I'm not on climate change, but on the ability of nuclear energy to mitigate climate change. But, if they have nuclear energy, yeah, sure, that's better. It's better than coal. It helps economic development, and South Korea knows this more than any other country. If you are looking to a long-term future where North Korea is more integrated into a world economy, nuclear energy might actually help. And of course, leaving nuclear energy in North Korea would track with the other precedents I mentioned. On the other hand, it continues the risks inherent in nuclear energy, especially if you're not able to eliminate enrichment and reprocessing. It could legitimize for future North Korean exports, right? Because, hey, North Korea has produced nuclear energy and nuclear assets, and it clearly, as we can see from the case of Syria, looks at these things as something they can export, which would complicate our nuclear supplier controls further. Shending Lee talked about the nuclear suppliers group. There's a debate about whether bringing India into the nuclear suppliers group complicates things. I would argue that. But nuclear energy overall, it's the highest risk for the highest cost. When you're looking at generation of electricity, no one can really dispute that, right? At this point, we've seen the data on cost of renewables. It's far better for us to push renewables or invest in the electricity grid, transmission and distribution for North Korea. But we'll leave that aside. Okay, so there are two futures. One is a non-cooperative scenario, which I call basically the status quo, and the other is a cooperative scenario. So in the non-cooperative scenario, things continue as we go forward. There are always going to be questionable safety and security implementation without a full return to the IAEA. North Korea withdrew from the IAEA in 1994. Those young engineers with whom we met in 2011, they're starving for information. They are starving for advice. And you can say we shouldn't help them, but Fukushima proves that nuclear accident anywhere is going to affect the countries in the region. To me, that's a scary future. In a cooperative scenario, again, these four questions: who collaborates, who pays, who inspects, and how much should they have? So on collaboration, I would suggest multilateral is preferable to bilateral in any case, right? The US shouldn't just be doing this with North Korea. South Korea shouldn't just be doing it, China or Russia. It should be multilateral. I think Toby made this point earlier. When we talk about nuclear cooperation in the US parlance, we're talking about actual agreements, 120, we call them Section 123 agreements. That's not ever going to happen. Ever. It's not ever going to happen because of all the things that Toby talked about in Congress. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do, right? Short of a nuclear cooperation agreement. We know that there will be a price tied to this, but let's be candid, it's cheap compared to the risks of an unregulated program in North Korea. It really would be cheap. International Atomic Energy Agency inspections are a minimum, but we shouldn't stop there. We should add bells and whistles that make an agreement or whatever we wind up with more credible and provide us with more transparency and more confidence on both sides. And that's tough with North Korea for a lot of reasons, but we're blue skying, so we need to pay attention to that. And then how much, I was a little cheeky here. I said, well, as little as you can get away with, but this will be some kind of negotiation. And I'm going to take a tiny little detour. I know we're short on time, but I really feel I have to make these points. Nuclear energy is never without proliferation risks. And we knew that from the very, very start, back to the 1946 Atchison-Lilienthal plan. And back then, people forget this report, but it's really quite interesting. The solution back then was to divide the fuel cycle into safe and unsafe elements. And it was very naive, but what's interesting is that we've carried these ideas forward, right? So here what you have is the safe elements on the left-hand side, small research reactors, light water reactors, they used to call it denatured fissile material, so low enriched uranium or plutonium. All these things you could safeguard. And remember, this is before safeguards, right? So, we learned a lot over the years. On the unsafe side, you had mining and milling, uranium enrichment, breeder reactors, reprocessing, R&D into nuclear weapons. And those elements you were supposed to internationalize. And why is this interesting to me? Because what happened over time is you can see the uranium enrichment, breeder, and reprocessing, that all moved into the safeguarded era. And the unsafe things, the only thing that remained was this R&D into nuclear weapons. That's always going to be unsafe. And, we should always try to avoid that. But even mining and milling, North Korea has mining and milling. We don't safeguard that anywhere. We do get some information. But so the point of all of that is that you need to step back and not simply say, oh, nuclear energy is safe, there's no proliferation risk, or nuclear energy is all bad, right? We need to look specifically at elements inside North Korea and outside. Okay, so what could, in my view, the DPRK program safely do? On radioisotopes, there was a little bit of, I think Toby briefly mentioned the IRT 2000 reactor. I say get rid of it, give them another option. It's really, really old. Use a cyclotron or do a radionuclide generator. There are other options for helping North Korea produce radioisotopes. On nuclear power generation, light water reactors, see if you can get a fuel supply and take back. I put in here also perhaps maybe floating small modular reactors, or what I call plug and play small modular reactors. You may know that I am not a big fan of small modular reactors because I think they're like the next solution that the nuclear energy industry has come up with to say, oh, these things won't cost a lot. But I will say, in 2011, when we met with Madam Che, she was interested in asking about SMRs. And it was a little embarrassing to say to her, oh, you've heard about these SMRs, but they're only on paper. They're paper reactors. It's 10 years later. There are countries developing them. So it's, maybe something to think about. On enrichment, they should not have an enrichment, or it should be somehow internationalized. I know that is radical. We can ask about it. No spent fuel, or we can talk about it. No spent fuel separation. I would say ban research reactors for 20 years, right? I mean, research reactors have played a long, long history in proliferation in terms of providing technical folks with ways to experiment with capabilities that they can later build on. I mean, you can use a research reactor to produce plutonium for a bomb. So they're not as safe as the Atchison Lilienthal plan thought they were. Breeder reactors, none. And, this is where advanced nuclear energy is moving in the wrong direction. And, when North Korea looks at all the options and they'll say, well, why shouldn't we have an advanced, breeder reactor? And yeah, we'll tweak it so that it doesn't really produce plutonium. That's just a whole world of heartache in my view. Mining and milling, they should do it with controls or international ownership. That could be a possible, if you want to talk about carrots and sticks, which I don't think is the right analogy, but one thing that the community has been thinking about for a while is, can you bring North Korea to develop mining and milling and then send the uranium overseas? Okay, my last thoughts right here. The argument for nuclear energy is to make lemonade out of lemons. You have something bitter and you need to make it palatable. My view is water is pretty tasty and healthy if you're thirsty. They are thirsty for electricity. We should be also helping them, providing them incentives with ways to produce electricity from renewables. Nonproliferation specialists tend to bend over backwards to promote safe nuclear energy. And, but sometimes it's just a bad idea. Even if you like nuclear energy, it's a bad idea. It's just, might not fit in your economic analysis. And then, pursuing nuclear energy for climate change. I know I put this as a reason way in the start for, supporting nuclear energy for North Korea, but it's the 21st century equivalent to let them eat cake. It's crazy in my mind, right? There's fast and cheap, whatever it is, you want it to be fast, cheap, and carbon free. So if nuclear energy fits that bill, great. But otherwise, maybe you need sourdough bread, not cake. Okay, thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Sharon. Okay, finally, our last panelist, John, you start.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you all and great to see colleagues. My special thanks to the NEREC Fellows. I think with what you're all working on, it's very important. This is why we're all gathered here. It's for you. And one of the things that I wanted to do with my presentation is to build on the excellent presentations we've heard and to approach it from a different angle. I think one way to categorize what we've heard was supply side dynamics. For panel 3 and looking at this question of how can North Korea have nuclear energy, I wanted to present to you all an argument, almost a red teaming aspect of it in a certain degree, but to provide an alternative perspective and looking at the demand side assessment. And this one is looking at it also from some of the ground truth and some of the localized economic development activity that's already happening. So what I'm about to present are building blocks of different elements that can be, I think, configured to an overall plan related to a Northeast Asian common market. And so the first part that I wanted to present here is looking at it from the dynamic of what's been happening in the China-North Korea relationship. This is something that I think is underexamined. It is something that has been growing in a tremendous way in a relatively short period of time. And if we look at it from internal Chinese economic development priorities, this early momentum was a big part of domestic Chinese economic development goals, goals that Chinese leadership has already surpassed. A core criterion of this was to have stable external environment on its borders. And within this, the three Chinese provinces comprise a key element of the leadership's development overall. And so with this, you saw very early on some interesting Sino-DPRK trade and investment, where these synergies, where you had Chinese capital and technology, particularly in the mining sector, combined with North Korean natural resources, leading to fairly remarkable, and again, in a short period of time, development and essentially operation of the North Korean mining sector. The key point here is that this activity took place with zero linkage to North Korean denuclearization. It wasn't a part of China helping on this front and essentially linking it and incentivizing North Korea to go down the road of denuclearization. This was a key element of the Communist Party of China, Workers' Party of Korea relationship, with the primary focus in this bilateral context for China to help stabilize the North Korean regime through this party mechanism. And so in many respects, this two-party approach was a higher political priority than the six-party. And the six-party, as we all know, with China as the chair, focusing on a multilateral solution to dealing with the North Korean nuclear challenge. And with this, you see a lot of movement with the bilateral relationship. And I think the inflection point was when then Vice Premier Wu Yi signed a multi-billion-dollar trade deal between North Korea and China. It was one of the big anniversaries. This was in October of 2005. A few days later, with the visit of President Hu Jintao, you're basically seeing the unleashing of different types of policies that have been happening below the surface from a Western perspective, but very much hiding in the open in a regional context. This is where if you piece the different elements together, you get to see a catalyst for regional economic development. And this is the argument that I put before you. The recent bilateral initiatives, particularly in the mining sector, leading to this engine of growth that was very intentional, that has documented spillover effects in the border region, the border trade. Some of this has been incentivized further by the application of sanctions. I won't go into too much detail here, but what we've been able to track with our research group is with the increasing application of sanctions on North Korean targets, you had the further growth of business inside of the Chinese marketplace, North Korean state trading companies using these local Chinese partners in that particular sense, where they're evading sanctions. But in a large part of this growth that we're seeing in the border region, these are benign. These are very much focused on economic development activities. These joint venture partners have established a track record where there's more and more of this kind of growth. The onset of the pandemic triggered self-imposed economic quarantine by the Kim regime is the outlier for the time being. But this type of activity, I think, is going to be dormant. And when there is some aspect of bringing the pandemic under control, there's a lot of pent-up demand that I think is going to restart this type of activity that was already there. The connection to the regional is with this model. And if you look at it from the European context, the European coal and steel community in the early 1950s essentially converted a strong bilateral relationship. This was between France and West Germany. That became the basis of regional economic development. So when you saw this initial part of it, it was government-led, development of a common market for these energy products and resources that became a catalyst for regional economic development. And as we saw the growth of the European community in the different phases, there are some interesting parallels. And with this, the part that I think is the demand side is when you see the public sector initiate and then the private sector gaining more speed here, there will be natural increases of energy demands. And from this, I think the civilian nuclear energy side comes into relief. Already, I think the provision of it coming from the Chinese side with a very ambitious domestic Chinese nuclear energy initiative that's well underway, being the first provision of it. But there is a North Korea piece of it when the political pieces are there. The other element of the plan aspect of it, so this is taking those pre-existing building blocks and assembling them. The market approach here is focused a lot on this multilateral economic development and creating a zone where already the movement previously there, harnessing it and having along the lines of a charter for Northeast Asian economic common market. And so the joint ventures, the different types of projects and activities already taking place. There were early aspects of value chain type of production, some of it sanctions evading, others and most of it a part of the regional economic development activity that have been gaining steam there. The drivers of this market approach, domestically, it is from the Chinese highest levels of the political hierarchy, the increased emphasis on economic development in the three Chinese provinces, Jilin, Liaoning, Heilongjiang, basically the provinces that have traditionally been left behind in the Chinese economic miracle. And so with this type of synergistic and organic border trade, you're seeing the further growth of the equivalent of opportunities for private investment. Some aspects of trying to court more players to come into this regional area. There are the early aspects of building this further with the launch of something along the lines of the Northeast Asian Development Bank. And there's talk in terms of adapting something that China already launched, the Asian Development Bank. And so these aren't new types of initiatives, greenfield, but rather adapting and applying existing models. Things that on the ground have been a part of the discussions outside of the nuclear discussions that we've been all tracking very closely. And so with this, if we put this all together, it is launched by the public sector, but led by the private sector. And a charter would be one way to see the different elements come together. And it's primarily a coordination of the regional countries' economic development goals and activities that are already taking place. So the charter would be more a function of coordinating and doing so in a way that it's sustainable. The aspect of the public sector here, bringing together these economic and energy cooperation deals, again, modeled on the European coal and steel community efforts. You saw the two primary actors by their very interactions and trading arrangements, France and West Germany. There are already parallels in terms of what China and North Korea do, particularly in the coal sector. So these type of agreements can be very effective in signaling to the private sector that this is, in practice, a reduction of business risk, something that has been shooing away business for a long period of time, largely because of geopolitical risk. Multilateral markets here become a way to see the pathway grow. And to reiterate, this is the area where we can see the increasing demand because of the increased multilateral market activity for different sources of energy. And all of this leading to, initially in the beginning, through these different types of activities and then formalization of a Northeast Asian economic community. I want to take the group here to a little bit of a stroll down memory lane. This is a graphic from Chosunilbo in the mid-2000s. Because as China did have these 50-year concessionary leases on North Korean mines, these were deals that were landmark deals at the time that came to fruition very quickly. We're looking at the second half of the 2000s where the North Korean mines started to export to China and fueled the steel industry in those three Chinese provinces. That in turn provided the steel and the basic requirements for further economic development in China as well. This is a powerful connection and a type of pattern and process that is well established in terms of this border dynamic here. There were strong concerns in South Korea, though, that Chinese economic interests with this type of developing of deals and relationships could pose long-term obstacles as South Korea was trying to figure out their own inter-Korean plans. Launching this Northeast Asian common market, there is a way to allay different concerns. In the case of South Korea here, this would be one way for South Korea to become a member of it. And with this, essentially lead to a situation where China isn't the dominant player, but there are other players. This could also provide South Korea, when the political situation is right, opportunity to work with local JV partners that are already in operation. So it's a function of scaling up. So as much as this might sound as pie in the sky and almost idealistic and dreaming aspect of it, I just want to remind the group, the building blocks here are already historic, they're precedents, they're already taking place. And the element here of the China-North commercial ties growing, and they continue to grow and attract separate from the denuclearization process. So even with the symmetry and the season of symmetry collapsing, and we heard that during the opening remarks as well by Chairman Moon, you're looking at a process that continued. The only thing that has stopped it is the pandemic component. And while there are very dark days and darker days to come on the pandemic side, this element of these type of commercial activities will reign. I think the restarting of it is something that would not be too far out of reach when the pandemic in the area is under control. But this is an idea as it grows further and the momentum already there, it's harnessing. This is clearly, and very importantly to state, something that would only take off in this kind of fashion after the nuclear issue is addressed. And that's something that in future permutations, how that might play out, it could be formal or informal. One aspect of the informal is just China continuing with the party-to-party approach and essentially doing the multilateralizing activity on the Chinese side, but eventually building out that energy need where in the future that could be part of the play. If it's formal aspect of bringing the nuclear issue into some version of a process, a denuclearization process, I think this is where the pieces can come together rather quickly. Let me conclude with the second and final point here, that growing this Northeast Asian economic community would be done on a demand side aspect. It wouldn't be the public sector using public funds to develop the type of projects. It would be very much driven by the market components here. And already the dynamics at play in the future trend lines, as we see them play out, I think give the sense of the portfolio of energy resources and tying all the pieces together, the nuclear energy component, initially starting on the Chinese side with their domestic program already, but connecting to something that will be organic on the North Korean side. From the private sector and the market perspective, I think that pathway is something that is much more tangible than the public sector approach as we've seen in the past. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. This session will conclude at 12:30. So even though schedule says that we have about 5-minute break, but I would like to suggest that we get into the discussion to save some time. Will it be okay? All right. So far, we have 6 very excellent and wonderful presentations. And obviously, the theme of this session, North Korea, we have a pending concern for North Korea's denuclearization. But at the same time, the point was raised that in order to solve a nuclear issue, perhaps we have to think about North Korean energy security. And in order to have that, there have been many suggestions, CTR, and even common market idea. All right. Having said that, I would like to invite from panelists to, if you have any comments or suggestion, please raise your hand. Or in the bottom panel of the Zoom app, you have the raising hand symbol. So raise your hand if you have any question or comments. Does anybody?
I have a question.
Yes, Chris.
Real quick. You mentioned these 50-year agreements on North Korean mines. Do those include the rare earth metals? So I've been reading in the press that there's supposedly these large reserves of rare earth metals. Is that accurate in North Korea? Is that accurate? And if so, is that included in those long-term agreements?
To whom this question is directed?
to John Park. I think we might have lost him. I don't see him on my screen. In which case, I'll have to.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Chris, yeah, thanks very much for your question. The early agreements in that early 2000s period were in coal and iron ore. And so the discussion of rare earth elements didn't really materialize in terms of future agreements that were at least tracked or public knowledge. But one of the things that it established were the mechanisms, the deals, the structures. You essentially see legal documents creating an opportunity later on to focus on other natural resources. And so to your question, those early agreements didn't focus on rare earth elements, but the mechanisms are in place to definitely make those kind of agreements in the future. I'll conclude right now, there are reports about China providing advanced petroleum products into North Korea. The North Koreans essentially paying for it in a barter system with resources. And it doesn't go into too much detail what those exact resources are. But I think that could be one of the mechanisms through which you see the rare earth elements becoming a focus of what China essentially is asking for the provision of these energy supplies.
May I follow up briefly, real quick? The reason I ask is, if those rare earth minerals exist in North Korea to the extent that I've read about, it seems as though the U.S. would have a long-term security interest in making sure that China is not the only one who is controlling those developments, given the fact that the Chinese control the vast majority of rare earth metals or rare earth minerals that are known to exist. And so does it have, it sounds like China is already sort of first in line, but are there other ways, to get other actors in earlier, given that there are probably security reasons from the U.S. perspective to do so, even aside from the nuclear issue?
Chris, it's a great question. And I think one of the unintended consequences of having such an elaborate and such an effective sanctions regime is that it prevents other private sector actors from doing that. You can try to carve out exceptions to it, but the de-risking phenomenon, you have some of the top tier and I would say best of breed companies and private sector actors that would be interested, essentially scared off by anything related to North Korea. The second thing I'd mention is, North Korea is an interesting situation right now because rare earth elements clearly is something that they are guarding. They don't want to have that as a focus of resource exploitation with China. But we're in a self-imposed economic crisis in North Korea where it's not by accident they stumbled into it. They did it on purpose because their hierarchy of concerns is preventing the spread of COVID. But in doing that and creating this domestic economic turmoil, their dependence on China is increasingly, at a level that we haven't seen. And so the conditions are there for China to start having barter arrangements where they will, I think it's pretty much next steps in terms of accessing and trying to get access to more of those rare earth elements.
Okay, I can see 3 hands raised. Toby, you're next.
Thanks. I wanted to follow up on Professor Shen Ding Li's remarks, which mostly focus on kind of the international politics and precedents of North Korean nuclear energy program. I was hoping that he might offer a few more remarks on Chinese views about kind of the specific shape and size and content of what a North Korean nuclear energy program might look like. I know that there have been concerns in China about nuclear safety in North Korea and the potential for accidents. So as Sharon outlined several kind of a U.S. view on what the content of a North Korean nuclear energy program look like, I wonder if there is an analogous view from China that you might characterize about whether certain types of technologies should be permitted or not, what to incentivize, what to try to steer clear from. Thank you.
Okay, Shonding, do you want to respond now?
Yes. Well, I cannot represent China. I try to understand and interpret China. If I start from a benign point of observation, China wants to balance that North Korea should have a life, but they should not threat the life of others. So in order to make sure they have a life, so China has generated a six-party talk to assure that they get heavy oil, they get institutional security promise. Meantime, they assure the rest of the grouping and the entire member of the world community that they are determined to abandon all their nuclear wherewithal. But all this should be done through a parallel approach. And China-US have a deep divide for this. Before six-party talks ended many years ago, probably I think 12 years ago, China said North Korea can continue to have civilian nuclear program. But at that time, the US team gave a nuanced approach. They strongly opposed to North Korea to keep civilian program before North Korea would abandon all military program. This is posted on the State Department website. But at the talk, they try to use the newest language with China and the rest of the grouping to make the talk not to collapse. So this is China's effort. North Korea abandons some, US gives some, and we give some. And North Korea abandon more, we give more. But don't expect North Korea to abandon all, and the world would do nothing before North Korea would achieve this. And this remains Chinese position until 2 or 3 years ago when Trump stipulated his policy that all options are on the table. Foreign Minister Wang Yi continued to say two-wheel theory, that when we push North Korea to move forward, incremental denuclearization, the rest of the world, including the UN, should also compensate North Korea in a commensurate way. But all this effort failed. This is a benign observation. China is responsible. China proposed a reasonable approach that I think most people today think is sensible. No matter you think it's ideal or it's legal or not legal, but it's ideal. But if I don't read the China's position in such a benign approach, then I would interpret the same thing through a very evil point of view. When the US beat China, China tried to please the US. China also beats North Korea. That forced North Korea to believe China is not a friend. Once you're abandoned by your former lover, you hate him or her even more. Like China hates Soviet Union, even though Soviet Union helped China to build up most of China's nuclear weapon programs infrastructure, China still hates the former Soviet Union. So now this thing happened between China and North Korea. When the US tried to meet with North Korea, China is scared. China tried to beat the US by wooing North Korea even more. So John has mentioned China has lots of economic partnership with North Korea, how this could be best developed into a regional framework, not a China-North Korean bilateral framework, especially outside of the denuclearization process. But China does not care this. China does not respect any UN Security Council resolution that any economic program with North Korea should only be conducted on a humanitarian basis. I don't trust. Most of China's program with North Korea is based on humanitarian. They are far more beyond, which means China violates all this UN Security Council resolution. But who beats China? Who condemns China? Who sanctions China? Why China would do? First, out of its selfishness or its ignorance, we want to build our Manchuria promise three Northeast China provinces because they are very close to the sea, and North Korea block us from accessing to the sea. So we need to get our economic opportunity.
Okay, Sean, please shorten your remarks, please.
Okay, 1 minute. So this is due to China's ignorance, but also I would have an evil view. China intentionally did this to make the North Korean nuclear denuclearization issue as a tool for China's strategy, not as a purpose for China's strategy.
Okay, Sharon.
Thank you so much. My question was also for Dan Qingli. And along the lines a little bit of what Toby was suggesting, you know, it's popular in the U.S. to say, or it has been popular in the U.S. to say, oh, China, you know, deal with North Korea's nuclear weapons. But on nuclear safety, I think there's a very compelling case that there are things that China could do. And I give as an example, you know, after India tested its nuclear devices in 1998, our Nuclear Regulatory Commission actually had a mission to India to talk about safety. That was one thing that we could carve out, even despite all the sanctions. And so I wondered if you had any insights into any activities that China has done in that regard, or whether there's some potential there. And the second question was, people forget, because they when they look at China and nuclear energy, that China actually spends 3 times more on wind generation, right? And so renewables, I think, would be a fantastic market for China to collaborate with North Korea. And I wonder if you had any views or responses on that. Thanks.
Okay, I'll collect a few more questions. Okay, Dr. Jeonbong-gun.
Yeah, my questions goes to my our American colleagues. Any of them could answer. I think that you know, our denuclearization diplomacy until probably 2010 was you know, much easier environment. You know, DPRK was a much weaker. Their nuclear capability was much smaller, and the U.S. was much superior. But we failed to, you know, prevent them moving towards the nuclear armament. You know, during the last few years, since 2010, the environment have changed. The DPRK was much stable, nuclear much capable, and China is much stronger. U.S. is, you know, U.S. is much, you know, distracted. It's still strong, but more distracted. Then we need to, you know, such a previous style of just, you know, press and wait strategy is not going to work. If we wait further, DPRK could accumulate more weapons. It could be just like any other, you know, de facto nuclear weapon state, like, you know, Pakistan or India. So in order to really press the DPRK to denuclearize, I think we need to be more concrete. The kind of you know, talks that we have today is you know, John Park was raised a very specific, you know, economic incentives by using multilateral setting, and also one of the session was, why don't we have you know, nuclear formula once again? And another, you know, specific incentive could be more of a U.S. DPRK diplomatic normalization, either beginning with opening, you know, offices in either capitals. Is there kind of a new approach in South Korea? You know, people who are for the dialogue were saying that we need a new approach, but is that going to be, you know, feasible, acceptable, or discussed in the States? How is it going?
Okay, Chris. Please be precise.
In response to that, or my next set of questions was a different topic, but maybe I'll my response to that is the conversation about North Korea issues is not looking good in Washington, but in the U.S., but we're trying to change that, I guess. I don't know. I think one of the biggest challenges with Biden, for instance, is that he's working on so many other issues, and it's kind of like all risk and not much payoff in terms of getting reelected. That, I think the Obama administration kind of, part of my interpretation of strategic patience was that the Obama administration kind of expended a lot of its capital with the Iran issue, and just kind of didn't have enough to also do the North Korea issue. And I think that I'm sorry to give you a pessimistic answer, but in terms of changing the way Americans think about diplomacy with North Korea, that's kind of what at least I'm trying to argue for. Another thing that I think makes it a lot more difficult now is that the U.S. backed out of the JCPOA. So, the thrust of my argument, or part of my argument, has always been that the big challenge is managing U.S. credibility, not North Korean credibility as much, or that maybe the overlooked part of the challenge is the U.S. credibility. Well, that's just got a lot harder after the U.S. backed out of the Iran deal. Those are my kind of thoughts on that. In terms of nuclear for nuclear, I've been afraid to say this in this talk because this is about this panel is about nuclear for nuclear, but I'm actually maybe a little bit more optimistic about some of these other areas of economic engagement with North Korea being folded into kind of an action for action plan. That's why I was asking about the mining issue. I've looked a lot at some of Moon Jae-in's new economic map policies or proposals, building rail infrastructure, stuff like that. But basically ways of that, giving North Korea other ways to matter internationally that don't rely on nuclear weapons and that potentially have benefits for actors outside of North Korea. With the goal of trying to offset some of the leverage forfeitures that they'd be making in rolling back their nuclear programs. Where nuclear fits into that, I'm not exactly sure, but that's actually the next set of topics I was hoping to talk about. But maybe either Toby or Sharon could respond to some of those issues that you brought up.
Well, I also have one question to Chris, to you. You mentioned that the kind of diplomatic design, a different concession, which is designed for political change. So could you elaborate a little more on what do you mean by political change? Is it diplomatic normalization or any other kind of economic engagement or what?
So in the case of the agreed framework, the political changes we were looking at normalization, as many of you know, we were looking at normalization and a peace treaty and a better political relationship between North Korea and the United States. But a lot of that stuff was not credibly expressible on paper. So I theorize the light water reactor as a way to build the physical embodiment of that different political relationship to then make those on paper changes seem more plausible down the road. I mean, I guess the basic idea is that political relationships between countries always, we tend to think of them as happening on paper or in our mind, or we talk about them, but they always have some physical embodiment to them. Whether that's in the form of trade or transit networks, shared infrastructure, financial interactions. And so the idea is to take the political commitments that are incredible on paper out of juridical or diplomatic space, and instead attempt to express them on the ground in the form of some type of infrastructure development. But then the question is how to design that. How to design that in a way that embodies the political relationship you'd like to see. And I think that, whether explicitly or implicitly, that is how I'm reading, for instance, some of the new economic map proposals. Like the adversarial relationship is embodied between the two Koreas, for instance, is embodied in the fact that there's no real transit between. There's no trade. There's none of this. There's no shared infrastructure, or there's minimal shared infrastructure. And if you can start to build some of those things, then potentially other things may become possible. And so if there's ways to and it's kind of sidestepping the nuclear issue. So I don't know if that's, sorry, I feel like I'm a little bit rambling, but it's kind of a picture in my mind that I'm trying to paint.
Okay.
But,
all right.
You know,
yeah. Okay, Sharon or Toby, do you have any response to Chris' question?
I'm not sure what the question was.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I recall Bong Yoon-jun asking a question that all the Americans would be in a position to answer about how the American kind of non-proliferation community thinks about engaging North Korea. Am I getting that right? And so I was just wanting to because I also had another topic I wanted to talk about that was going to bring Toby and Sharon some of your remarks earlier together, but that's sort of a different topic. So I was just, I didn't want to be the only one who was hogging all the time.
So just, oh yeah, Bong-gun, do you want to clarify?
Yeah, I want to just make a very quick comment to Chris Lawrence. I worked at the Blue House in 1993 and 4. And I was not directly in charge of this, but somehow Kido Affairs was in my purview. At the time, in Korea, still we are more of a conservative situation. So many people didn't like it, but somehow we accepted it. But one of my arguments for it was that in order to fulfill this construction of LWR plans, DPRK should be changed. Without it, you cannot really provide it. And also, in order to provide light water reactor to the DPRK, there should be U.S. DPRK nuclear agreement. They should be, based on their diplomatic normalization. So if we are going to really push forward this project, DPRK is going to change. It's going to receive IAEA inspections, and the U.S. should be normalized, diplomatic normalization. There was a kind of the basic reasons behind the proponents of these ideas, but both of them failed to really go track forward on that either side.
I'm happy to respond to that, but I feel like I'm hogging a lot of time. I can respond offline, but
maybe I can jump in briefly, and Sharon, please feel free as well. So Bong-gun, on your questions about whether there's any appetite for other kinds of sort of new approaches or new models, I think for the reasons that Chris laid out, there's very few reasons for optimism at this point. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to be creative and push for alternative approaches. I just think that this is not quite the administration, or at least it's not quite the right time for this administration to do that. Maybe they'll find some courage later. But I was thinking that there is another model of sort of techno-diplomacy that we might look to, and that's the Kaesong complex as sort of an economic techno-diplomacy, very different than the LWR project. And I'm curious, how is that project and how it's been at times a political football in inter-Korean relations? At times it's gone very well. At times it's been, viewed as kind of a symbol or a sacrificial lamb, to mix lots of metaphors. Is that seen as something that provides a model that could be replicated again? Is a kind of more durable political commitment and economic commitment from South Korea to the development of more stable ties, inter-Korean ties? Or is it seen at this point as kind of a less successful model that shouldn't be replicated?
All right, Dr. John, do you have an answer? Okay, I'll ask Shunding to respond to Charlotte's question, but because I'm expecting some question from floor, please be precise. I give you 1 minute.
Okay, I think technically China can help North Korea's safety for its light water reactor. But it's risky to do this on a one-on-one basis. So better to put it in the framework of IAEA or a future possible renewed multilateral system. And second, for wind project, I have never heard of this. I think most of China North Korean program are for China's own benefit, for China's own tapping of North Korea's resource. China may have not thought about how to build North Korea a normal country by helping creating its a normal system. This is some issue China may have not thought about, but China should think about it. Better through what John has suggested, through a regional multilateral process.
All right, thank you. Well, is there any question from the floor? Yuna, could you?
Hello, my name is.
Yes.
Oh, yes, I do have actually 2 questions. I was kindly handed the mic. So my name is Kayla Orta, and I'm currently finishing up my master's at Seoul National University. I actually, oh, okay. I actually just finished. I'm finishing up my master's, focusing on U.S., South Korea, North Korea relations during the 1990s agreement. So this discussion was very wonderful to hear, and to hear the debate around particularly keto. And so I actually have one question for the first panel, directed mostly toward Professor Lawrence and Dr. Dalton, and then a second question, if possible, to the second panel, focusing toward Professor Jun. So my first question to Professor Lawrence and Dr. Dalton: if the argument is that we need a keto 2.0, at least structurally speaking, how can we guarantee that U.S.-North Korean engagement is not held hostage to economic and political limitations of U.S. politics? Infrastructural investment is expensive and politically fraught. How it will be possible to maintain long-term interest and investment to continue a techno-diplomacy cycle through multiple iterations, especially considering current polarization in Congress, as well as legal restrictions for direct U.S. financing to North Korea? So yes, that was the question to the first panel. The second question, and this I said is directed a bit more toward Professor Jun, but I'm curious about other opinions as well. And my question is I'm a little curious about the premise that North Korea would be willing to exchange their nuclear weapon program for a nuclear energy program. Trade for light water reactors was a central component of the agreed framework, but that was over 25 years ago. And arguably North Korea is not the North Korea it was then, and the nuclear weapon program is way more advanced and arguably by the North Koreans completed. So I'm a little curious how it would be tradable in that sense, especially also given the fact that Kim Jong-un is not like his grandfather Kim Il-sung or his father Kim Jong-il. So I'm curious as to how you think leadership, and so what basis can we assume that North Korean leadership would still be interested or even willing to trade their nuclear program for nuclear energy? Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask questions. I greatly enjoyed the debate.
Okay, thank you. While panelists are preparing their answer, I would like to invite one more question from the floor, because time limit, one more only.
Hello, thank you very much. I am Sophia. I am completing my, not really completing, but studying international relations at King's College London. And I was wondering, in the framework of an engagement approach that we said cannot be delivered by the US alone anymore, also given tensions, current tensions in the region, and given the need for a macro-political effort, what can be the alternative to this US leadership that has happened up to now? And how can, as we've mentioned, China's leverage be useful to the purpose of denuclearization itself? Like, also given the situation of North Korean economic dependence on China. Thank you so much.
Well, okay, thank you. I apologize, I cannot accept any more questions from the floor because it's almost time. So for the first question, who would you respond? Toby or Chris?
I'm happy to briefly respond.
Okay, yeah, Chris.
and I'm going to disappoint that I don't have the answer to that question, but part of the goal of my writing is to try to shift attention toward that question. I think one of the failures of the agreed framework emerged from the fact that Congress made sure that no U.S. no U.S. money would go to the light water reactors. That meant over that time, there were no constituencies built in the United States that would have a stake in the agreed framework surviving. I think a similar weakness is at the heart of the JCPOA, in a sense that really the only people talking about investing in Iran, and it's a matter of whether or not the US will get out of the way. I think that's absolutely the challenge. There needs to be some way of building constituency in the United States and that would have some stake in survival of the agreement that would survive the change of administrations. That, I think, is the big challenge. I'm afraid I don't have the answer. And part of the reason I don't have the answer is because I'm not an expert in international finance. So maybe I'll just throw out a pie in the sky, what will probably come off as a pie in the sky idea. But if there was some infrastructure project associated with maybe Moon Jae-in's economic map, new economic map projects, that there could be maybe export-import bank financing for. My understanding is that passes through Congress, or that money is already allocated, and that that's why I'm struggling to answer this question. It's something I need to actually look into further. But the goal of export-import financing, or one of them, is to make investments that then filter back into U.S. jobs. Mining infrastructure is something that would do that. There are companies like Schlumberger in the United States that create mining infrastructure. I don't know if that's the case for rail infrastructure, but if there was some way to sort of create U.S. financing that's not just driven by the market and by economic opportunity, but by actually a desire for the U.S. to both influence, economic the course of events on the Korean Peninsula, as well as to create U.S. jobs. That's my sort of pie in the sky answer to that question. But I'm sorry, it's not a very satisfying one, especially given what we know about the current U.S. discussion about North Korea and the.
Okay, thank you. Dr. John Bong-gun, you have 1 minute.
When there is a change of government in the U.S., how can we sustain, U.S. policy toward the DPRK? I don't think it's up to U.S. It's up to U.S. But the problem was that as long as U.S. politician was saying that if there is a war, that's going to happen in Korea. It's not in the U.S. Meaning that they don't care much about what's happening in the Korean Peninsula. So in that case, it's hard to sustain U.S. North Korea diplomacy consistently. And I believe that now DPRK already have accomplished their nuclear armament. Are they going to trade? It's not going to happen easily. But DPRK, I'm interested in this nuclear for nuclear because Kim Jong-un said twice, either to our president and President Trump, that it's going to be, give up their nuclear weapons. They are going to pursue denuclearization. In that case, nuclear for nuclear is going to have some room. But as long as the DPRK is on the track of nuclear armament, there is no room at all.
All right, Sharon, you raised the hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that second question, the alternative to U.S. leadership. I'm going to say there is no alternative to U.S. leadership, not because I think we do such a great job, but because of the regional tensions that have, existed because of the relationship between Japan, South Korea, and China. I think the U.S. really has to be a player there. On the one hand, Bong-gun Jun's original question was, look, we're in a very different place now. What's going to make this better, right? North Korea is much. No, I would like everybody to raise their hand on this panel who thinks North Korea is about to give up their nuclear weapons in the next 10 years. You know, I don't think any of us does. But there are ways. We have an obligation. I think there's an imperative for us to build more trust. I don't know, you know, I'm skeptical about technical diplomacy, maybe because I advised Congress, maybe because I was part of it in the State Department. I think there are some very good intentions and things go awry. But it is clear that the North Koreans, that we need relationships with them and we have to build them. I think right now, Sung Kim is the best possible person to do this for us, but he also has a day job. And that's another, like all these really weird little bureaucratic problems that we faced. The US doesn't learn its lessons, right? He needs to give up his day job as ambassador to Indonesia to demonstrate to the North Koreans that we are serious about this. And of course, we cannot do this without China. And I would argue we need to bring in Russia also. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on quite that long, but we're in a different place, but there are still some positive things there. And I think for the first time, if Trump did anything, he opened up the question of possible normalization. The big question is, what is South Korea? How long is South Korea's patience with North Koreans' nuclear weapons? They can't stay there forever, right? So Thank you.
Okay, John, you're the last.
I just wanted to quickly add to this. You know, if we pose this question, if we think about it based on current trend lines, what would be the source of civilian nuclear energy flowing through North Korean grid? The answer would be China. You know, in Hongyanhe in Liaoning, there's already a power plant with 4 reactors in operation, 2 more online. So it's almost like keto on steroids. And you know, with this pause because of the pandemic, it's momentary. Those trend lines are, I don't think you can reverse them. And so while we continue to debate about the US role and whether North Korea would give up nuclear weapons, and we're going to continue that debate, that's a very important one. The economic reality and that inertia that's there, I should say the momentum, I wanted to conclude by saying that a lot of the things that we are seeking to incorporate as incentives in negotiations with North Korea, it's not that they're on the table, they've already been given. And so we have to factor that into our analysis as well. Lifting of the sanctions component is important, but North Korea clearly views that as they want to continue working on that, but they're going to work on diversifying these other opportunities that are already in play. And that's, I think, at the heart of Pongwon's question. What's different now compared to that time period where North Korea didn't have the capabilities and where the likelihood that they're going to give it up? We've crossed that threshold. And so this is the new reality that we have to contend with. Nuclear weapons North Korea that enjoys a lot of the benefits that Chris has laid out. And so this is the dilemma and the challenge here, because the problem is now become multifaceted, and it no longer requires a US-North Korea deal. That is preferred, but there are alternatives. And I would end on that note.
All right, thank you. Well, it's already past 12:30, so sorry for not accepting any more questions or comments. This is really wonderful panel and discussion. Well, I assume that NEREC fellows watching this program, most of them have fully understand how complex is this issue. North Korea's denuclearization, and also North Korea's nuclear energy security. This is part of this should be part of the equation. So we don't know the answer yet. But anyhow, through this kind of a exchange of views, perhaps we can find some more creative idea that can push us forward. So for NEREC Fellows Program, I appreciate already this wonderful panel. And I also appreciate the 6 panelists who made a wonderful presentation and discussion. So this is the end of the session, and thank you once again. And I hope to see you soon face to face. Thank you. This is the end of the session.